Imagine walking into a room and noticing a person with striking physical beauty, impeccably dressed in tailored clothing, with confident posture and a warm smile. Without knowing anything substantive about this individual, you immediately assume they are intelligent, kind, trustworthy, and competent. You find yourself drawn to their opinions, more willing to believe what they say, and more inclined to trust their judgment on matters entirely unrelated to their appearance. This automatic leap from one observable positive quality to an assumption of numerous other positive qualities is known as the halo effect, one of the most pervasive and influential cognitive biases shaping human perception and decision-making. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through what psychologists call implicit association and cognitive efficiency. When our brains encounter a person or entity with one salient positive characteristic, we unconsciously extend that positivity to fill in gaps of information we do not yet possess. Rather than gathering complete data before forming judgments, our minds take a shortcut, using the single bright impression as a kind of lighthouse that illuminates how we interpret all subsequent information about that person. This happens because our brains are designed to process enormous amounts of information constantly, and this shortcut allows us to make quick judgments without becoming paralyzed by uncertainty. We see this effect operating across countless domains of human life and society. Physically attractive individuals receive higher salaries, receive more favorable treatment in court proceedings, and are rated as more honest by complete strangers despite having no connection between appearance and these qualities. Celebrities are assumed to possess expertise on matters far removed from their actual field simply because they are famous. Companies with polished branding and sleek marketing are trusted more readily than competitors with identical products but less refined presentation. Imagine you are walking along a suspension bridge that sways slightly in the wind, your heart racing as you cross the narrow passage high above a deep ravine, your palms sweating with the physical sensations of fear and adrenaline coursing through your body. And at that exact moment, an attractive stranger approaches you and strikes up a conversation, smiling warmly and making eye contact with genuine interest in what you have to say. In this scenario, you are far more likely to feel a sudden attraction to this person, to perceive them as more appealing and charming than you might have found them under ordinary circumstances, and perhaps even to exchange contact information or agree to meet again, not because they possess any exceptional qualities, but because your nervous system has misattributed the source of your physiological arousal. The racing heart, the heightened alertness, the rush of adrenaline that your body was producing in response to the physical danger of the bridge environment becomes unconsciously reframed by your mind as a response to the presence of this person, as though they themselves are causing your excitement and elevated emotional state. This is the phenomenon of misattribution of arousal, a cognitive bias where we assign the source of our physical and emotional activation to the wrong cause, confusing internal states that have nothing to do with a person or stimulus for genuine attraction or preference toward that stimulus. The mechanism operates because our conscious mind does not automatically have direct access to why our body is aroused in any given moment. We feel the sensations of heightened heart rate, increased blood flow, dilated pupils, and nervous energy, but we must then consciously interpret and label the source of these physical responses. And when multiple potential causes are present simultaneously, we often choose the most salient or socially relevant one available to us in that context. Consider the countless moments throughout human history when the color red has commanded attention and shaped behavior in ways that seem almost involuntary. Picture a woman walking into a job interview wearing a crimson blouse, or a man selecting a red tie for an important negotiation, or notice how dating profiles with red in the thumbnail photograph receive significantly more engagement than identical profiles presented in other colors. In retail environments, price tags printed in red draw the eye with remarkable consistency, while in traffic systems across the globe, red signals danger and demands immediate compliance without question. Even in nature documentaries, predators often display red coloration as a warning of their potency, and the most dominant primates in social hierarchies exhibit flushed red faces as displays of power and reproductive fitness. The color red appears in our consciousness not as a neutral aesthetic choice, but as a carrier of meaning so deeply embedded that it operates almost beneath our awareness. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon traces back to our evolutionary heritage and the way our visual system processes certain wavelengths of light. Red occupies a unique position in the spectrum of human perception because it was historically associated with both immediate threats and vital resources necessary for survival, from blood loss to nutritional ripeness in fruits, creating neural pathways that still activate arousal, attention, and heightened alertness in our brains today. This association became so wired into our neurobiology that exposure to red light actually increases heart rate, raises blood pressure, and enhances physical performance in measurable ways, a phenomenon documented across countless studies in sports psychology and human physiology. Imagine you find yourself in a social situation where you have experienced a minor conflict or misunderstanding with another person, perhaps a colleague at work or someone in your community with whom you have had a lukewarm relationship. Instead of waiting for time to heal the divide, you approach this person with a genuine but modest request for help, asking them to assist you with something that requires their particular skills or knowledge. What follows in the weeks and months afterward is a remarkable shift in their attitude toward you. They begin to treat you with noticeably more warmth and friendliness, they go out of their way to offer additional assistance, and they speak positively about you to others. This phenomenon, which traces its origins to Benjamin Franklin himself and his documented account of winning over a political rival by borrowing a rare book from him, reveals something profoundly counterintuitive about human psychology and the formation of social bonds. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through what psychologists call cognitive dissonance and self-perception theory. When someone does you a favor, particularly someone who previously felt ambivalent or negative toward you, their mind must reconcile the contradiction between their behavior and their pre-existing feelings about you. Rather than accepting that they help someone they dislike, their brain resolves this tension by adjusting their attitude and beliefs about you, essentially convincing themselves that they must actually like and value you because their actions suggest this to be true. The person gradually becomes your advocate not because you have forced them to, but because they have unconsciously adjusted their internal narrative to align with their external behavior. Imagine a scenario where you observe someone you deeply admire, perhaps a renowned public figure or a highly competent professional, making a significant mistake or experiencing an embarrassing moment in front of others. Rather than diminishing your regard for them, something unexpected occurs within your psychology. You actually feel more connected to them, more sympathetic toward them, and paradoxically, you may even view them as more likable and approachable than before the mishap took place. This phenomenon is known as the Pratfall Effect, a term derived from physical comedy where a performer deliberately falls to generate laughter and endearment from the audience. The mechanism underlying this psychological response operates through the reduction of perceived distance between yourself and the admired figure. When someone demonstrates perfection consistently, they may appear unreachable, inhuman, or so elevated above the ordinary human experience that connection becomes difficult to establish on a genuine level. However, when that same person reveals vulnerability, makes an error, or experiences a moment of clumsiness or social awkwardness, they suddenly become relatable, authentic, and humanized in your perception. The Pratfall Effect suggests that minor flaws, mistakes, and imperfections actually enhance likability and trustworthiness rather than diminish these qualities, particularly when the person demonstrating the flaw is otherwise exceptionally competent. This response persists despite the logical inconsistency that a mistake should theoretically reduce confidence in someone's abilities, yet somehow our brains interpret vulnerability as honesty and imperfection as authenticity. We have normalized this response so thoroughly that we now actively expect and appreciate when high-status individuals acknowledge their own shortcomings, seeing such admissions as signs of genuine character rather than legitimate concerns about competence. Consider walking past a billboard on your daily commute, an advertisement you initially found unremarkable or even slightly irritating. Yet after weeks of repeated exposure, you find yourself humming the jingle or feeling a subtle warmth toward the brand without any conscious decision to do so. This is the mere exposure effect in its most mundane manifestation, a psychological phenomenon where repeated exposure to a stimulus leads to an increase in liking for that stimulus, regardless of whether the stimulus itself has objectively changed or whether any new information about it has been presented to you. The mechanism operates at a level below conscious awareness, functioning through the reduction of uncertainty and the creation of cognitive fluency. When we encounter something unfamiliar, our brains register a mild threat response, a slight discomfort born from the unknown. With each subsequent exposure, however, the stimulus becomes more predictable, less cognitively taxing to process, and therefore more comfortable to our minds. This ease of processing gets misattributed as affection or preference, a fundamental confusion between familiarity and actual liking that our brains readily make. The effect persists with remarkable consistency across cultures, age groups, and types of stimuli, from visual images to sounds to people themselves, suggesting that it taps into something deeply fundamental about how human cognition evolved and operates. We have come to rely on this effect so thoroughly that entire industries are built upon it, from advertising and marketing to political campaigns and social media algorithms that deliberately engineer repeated exposure to cultivate preference and attachment. Yet despite understanding the mechanism, despite being able to articulate exactly why we feel drawn to something simply because we have seen it many times, we continue to experience the effect with undiminished force, a testament to the gap between intellectual knowledge and the automatic processes governing our emotional responses and decision-making patterns. Imagine you receive a small gift from someone you have never met, perhaps a pen with their company logo, or a sample of a product, or even just a genuine compliment offered without expectation of return. Almost immediately, an invisible weight settles upon you, a subtle obligation that whispers you should do something nice for them in return, that accepting something without giving back creates an imbalance in the social equation that your mind quietly demands you correct. This is the reciprocity principle in its most elemental form, and it operates with remarkable consistency across virtually every human culture and interaction. The mechanism underlying this principle is rooted in our deep evolutionary history and our fundamental need to maintain cooperative relationships within groups. When someone provides us with something of value, whether tangible or intangible, our brain registers this as a deposit in what psychologists call the social exchange bank, and we experience an automatic drive to make a withdrawal of equal or greater value in return. This system evolved because it created the foundation for all human cooperation, allowing strangers to extend trust and resources to one another with the confidence that the favor would eventually be reciprocated, thereby enabling trade, mutual aid, and the complex social structures that allowed human civilization to flourish. What makes this principle particularly fascinating is how deeply ingrained it has become in our psychology, operating almost entirely beneath our conscious awareness, so that we often feel compelled to reciprocate even when we recognize intellectually that no obligation truly exists, even when the initial gift was explicitly offered without expectation or condition, and even when reciprocating might not serve our own interests. Consider the experience of browsing an online marketplace where you discover a product you find moderately interesting, perhaps a piece of clothing or a book that appeals to you in a casual way, yet you feel no immediate urgency to purchase it. However, the moment you notice a small red banner declaring only 3 items left in stock, or this sale ends in 2 hours, something shifts within your psychology, and suddenly that same product feels infinitely more desirable and worthy of your immediate financial commitment. This phenomenon is the scarcity principle in its most recognizable form, and it operates on a fundamental human instinct that perceives limited availability as an indicator of genuine value. The mechanism underlying this principle is rooted in our evolutionary past, where resources were genuinely scarce and limited, meaning that anything difficult to obtain or in short supply was typically worth acquiring quickly before it disappeared entirely. Our ancestors developed a cognitive shortcut that equated rarity with importance, and this ancient wiring still fires within our modern minds, even when we consciously understand that artificial scarcity is being weaponized against us by marketers and retailers. We find ourselves caught in a peculiar psychological trap where we grant greater value to something simply because it is unavailable to others or because its availability window is closing, regardless of whether the scarcity is real or manufactured. What makes this principle particularly fascinating is how readily we fall into this pattern despite understanding it intellectually, despite knowing that the scarcity is often deliberately created or exaggerated for commercial purposes, and despite the fact that the actual utility or quality of the product has not fundamentally changed from one moment to the next. Imagine walking down a street in an unfamiliar city where you encounter 2 restaurants side by side, each serving similar cuisine at similar prices. Yet one establishment has its windows crowded with diners while the other sits nearly empty, and without tasting a single dish or reading a single review, you find yourself naturally drawn toward the busier venue, assuming that the presence of other people somehow validates the quality of the experience that awaits you inside. This phenomenon, known as social proof, represents one of the most pervasive influences on human decision-making and behavior, operating quietly beneath the surface of our consciousness whenever we find ourselves uncertain about the right choice to make. The psychological mechanism underlying social proof stems from a fundamentally reasonable place within our evolutionary history, for throughout human development, observing the actions and choices of others has served as a reliable shortcut to understanding our environment when direct experience was unavailable, or when the stakes of making a wrong decision were potentially high. When we encounter situations laden with ambiguity or uncertainty, our brains instinctively treat the behavior of others as informational currency, essentially asking ourselves that if many people are choosing this option, selecting this product, or behaving in this manner, then there must be something valuable or correct about it that justifies their collective action. Yet what makes social proof particularly fascinating is how thoroughly it persists even when we possess direct access to objective information that might contradict the consensus around us, and how readily we surrender our own judgment to the apparent wisdom of crowds, even in cases where those crowds may be responding to the very same social proof that influences us, creating recursive loops of influence that have no logical foundation in actual quality or truth. Consider a moment when you find yourself sitting across from someone you naturally connect with, and without any conscious effort, you notice that your posture begins to match theirs, your gestures echo their movements, and even the pace of your speech aligns with the rhythm of their words, creating an invisible synchronization that deepens the sense of rapport and understanding between you. This phenomenon, known as the mirroring effect, occurs when individuals unconsciously imitate the body language, mannerisms, facial expressions, and speech patterns of those around them, particularly those with whom they wish to establish connection or whom they perceive as holding status or authority. The mechanism behind this behavior operates on a fundamentally neurological level, where mirror neurons in the brain activate when we observe another person's actions, essentially simulating those actions within our own neural pathways as if we were performing them ourselves, which creates a sense of empathy and understanding that feels organic and natural. When we mirror someone, we are essentially sending a subtle message that says we are similar, that we understand them, and that we are safe to trust, because sameness breeds comfort and comfort breeds attraction. This mirroring effect extends far beyond casual conversation and into the realm of influence, where skilled communicators, therapists, and negotiators deliberately employ mirroring techniques to build rapport with their counterparts, often achieving remarkable results in terms of persuasion and agreement. Yet despite the fact that mirroring is ultimately a mechanical process rooted in our evolutionary past, we experience it as authentic connection and genuine understanding, never questioning whether the person before us is intentionally crafting their behavior to influence our perception of them, and we remain largely unaware that we are doing the same thing in return, creating a kind of mutual choreography where both parties dance to the rhythm of influence and attraction without acknowledging the artifice that may underlie it. When two people engage in conversation, particularly one charged with emotional significance or romantic interest, something subtle occurs within the human eye that neither party consciously controls or even recognizes in the moment. The pupils, those dark circles at the center of the iris, begin to expand and contract in response to stimuli that have nothing to do with light levels or visual focus. This involuntary response, known as pupil dilation, has been documented across countless psychological studies and represents one of the most honest signals the human body can send, because it operates entirely beneath the threshold of conscious manipulation. When someone finds another person attractive, interesting, or trustworthy, their pupils dilate noticeably, sometimes expanding by as much as 30% in diameter, flooding their eyes with a quality of openness and receptivity that communicates genuine engagement. This biological response occurs because the autonomic nervous system, that ancient part of our brain responsible for survival and attraction, floods the body with norepinephrine and other neurochemicals during moments of genuine interest or desire, and the pupils respond directly to this internal chemical cascade. Throughout human history, individuals have developed an intuitive sensitivity to these pupil changes, even though they cannot articulate exactly what they are observing, and this sensitivity has shaped countless social interactions, romantic encounters, and negotiations in ways that remain largely invisible to conscious awareness. We have normalized this silent language of the eyes so completely that most people never stop to consider that they are constantly reading and broadcasting these signals, making judgments and feeling drawn to certain individuals based partly on whether their pupils suggest reciprocal interest and attraction. Consider the person who checks their phone repeatedly throughout the day, never knowing exactly when a message or notification will arrive, yet feeling compelled to look again and again with persistent hope and anticipation. Or think of the gambler at the slot machine, pulling the lever with the knowledge that most pulls will result in nothing, yet certain that the next one might deliver the jackpot they seek. These are not isolated examples of human behavior, but rather demonstrations of one of the most powerful principles in psychology: intermittent reinforcement. This principle describes a pattern of reward delivery where positive outcomes are not given consistently or predictably, but rather appear at random or variable intervals, creating a psychological state far more powerful than if rewards were delivered every single time. The mechanism behind this phenomenon lies in the fundamental way our brains process expectation and reward. When we know that a behavior will always result in a specific outcome, our motivation stabilizes at a certain level and we can adapt to it. But when outcomes become unpredictable, our brains enter a state of heightened anticipation and engagement. The uncertainty itself becomes the fuel that drives repetition and persistence. Each unrewarded attempt does not diminish motivation as logic might suggest it should. Instead, it intensifies the desire to try again because the possibility of reward remains alive in the mind. This pattern is so effective at shaping behavior that it has become embedded throughout our modern world without our conscious recognition of its power. Loyalty programs reward purchases at unpredictable levels. Social media platforms deliver likes and comments in irregular patterns. Dating applications show matches and messages sporadically. And entertainment platforms present binge-worthy content with cliffhangers designed to maximize the uncertainty of what comes next. Consider the scenario where someone you are interested in romantically makes themselves less available than they could be, responding to messages after deliberate delays, declining invitations occasionally despite having free time, or maintaining an air of mystery about their thoughts and feelings rather than offering complete transparency. In these moments, the pursuer often finds themselves more captivated, more willing to invest effort, more hopeful about the possibility of connection, and more convinced of the value of the pursued person. This phenomenon operates on several interconnected psychological principles that shape how we perceive value and desirability. When something is scarce or difficult to obtain, our minds automatically assign greater worth to it, a principle deeply rooted in scarcity psychology where limited access creates the illusion of increased value. Additionally, the uncertainty introduced by unavailability or mixed signals activates what psychologists call the Zeigarnik Effect, where our brains remain more engaged with incomplete or ambiguous situations, creating a persistent mental loop of thought and anticipation about the person who remains slightly out of reach. Furthermore, when we must work harder to achieve something or someone, we tend to value our achievement more highly through the justification of effort, convincing ourselves that the difficulty itself proves the worth of the prize. The irony of this dynamic lies in how it persists despite its fundamental illogic, for it creates a system where genuine availability and honest expression of interest become liabilities rather than assets, punishing the very behaviors that would facilitate authentic connection while rewarding strategic manipulation and emotional withholding. We have collectively normalized this dance, teaching generations through culture and media that playing hard to get is not merely acceptable but actually necessary, turning what amounts to emotional unavailability into a desirable trait masquerading as attractive confidence or independence. Imagine sitting down to watch your favorite television series, and just as the episode reaches its most crucial moment, just as the protagonist is about to reveal the truth that will change everything, the screen fades to black and the credits roll. Your mind refuses to settle. Hours later, you find yourself thinking about what might happen next, unable to focus on other tasks, replaying the final scenes, and constructing countless possibilities for how the story will unfold. This is the Zeigarnik Effect at work, a cognitive phenomenon first documented by Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik in the 1920s. She observed that people tend to remember incomplete or interrupted tasks far better than completed ones, and that this memory retention creates a psychological tension that demands resolution. The effect occurs because our brains are naturally drawn toward closure and completion. When we encounter something unfinished, our minds generate what researchers call an open loop, a mental file that remains active and unresolved in our working memory. This open loop creates a subtle but persistent sense of psychological discomfort, a tension that our brains interpret as important and urgent. Your mind essentially refuses to file the experience away until it has reached a satisfying conclusion. This mechanism likely evolved because incomplete situations in our ancestral environment often represented threats or opportunities that required attention and resolution. A partially solved problem could mean the difference between survival and danger, so our ancestors developed brains that prioritized unfinished business. Yet despite living in a modern world where cliffhangers pose no actual threat to our survival, this ancient psychological mechanism continues to operate with remarkable consistency. We remain susceptible to this effect even when we consciously understand that postponing the conclusion causes us no real harm. Content creators, advertisers, and storytellers have integrated this understanding into their craft, deliberately structuring narratives with suspenseful breaks to maintain our attention and engagement. Imagine you have spent an entire evening at a restaurant with friends, enjoying good conversation and shared laughter throughout the night. Yet near the end of the meal, the waiter brings you cold food or delivers an unexpectedly rude comment. And when you leave, you find yourself remembering that experience as disappointing, despite the hours of genuine enjoyment that preceded it. This phenomenon, known as the Peekend Rule, describes how our minds do not evaluate experiences based on their total duration or the average quality of all moments involved, but rather give disproportionate weight to the most intense moment, called the peak, and to the final moment as the experience concludes. The psychological mechanism underlying this tendency appears to be rooted in how our memory systems prioritize information for storage and retrieval, treating emotionally intense moments as more important signals worthy of preservation, while the final moment gains significance because it represents the last piece of information our brain processes and thus the most readily accessible memory when we later reflect on the experience. Our brains have evolved to focus on what might be most consequential for survival and decision-making, and indeed, how an experience ends could theoretically matter more for our future choices than the mundane middle sections. So this rule once served adaptive purposes in ancestral environments. Yet in modern life, this mechanism often leads us astray, causing us to misjudge experiences, make poor decisions about which activities to repeat or avoid, and feel dissatisfied with circumstances that objectively provided substantial value and pleasure throughout their duration. Consider the experience of a homeowner who receives a knock on their door from a representative asking them to simply answer a quick survey about their satisfaction with local services, a request so minor and seemingly inconsequential that most people agree without much thought. Once this initial agreement has been secured, the representative returns days or weeks later with a larger request, perhaps asking the homeowner to allow a brief inspection or to consider a service upgrade, and remarkably, the homeowner finds themselves significantly more likely to agree to this second request than they would have been if the representative had asked for it directly from the start. This pattern, known as the foot-in-door technique, reveals a profound truth about how human commitment operates within the architecture of our minds and social interactions. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon rests upon a basic principle of cognitive consistency, whereby once we have committed to a position or agreed to an action, our brains begin to reorganize our self-perception and beliefs to align with that commitment, creating an internal narrative that justifies our initial agreement and makes subsequent related requests feel like natural extensions of our existing position rather than new decisions requiring independent evaluation. When we say yes to something small, we unconsciously begin telling ourselves that we are the type of person who would help, who is generous, or who is interested in these matters, and this self-image becomes a psychological anchor that pulls us toward consistency in our future actions. What is particularly fascinating is how deeply this mechanism persists despite our logical understanding of it, for even when we consciously recognize that an initial request was designed to manipulate us, we still find ourselves experiencing a genuine pull toward compliance with subsequent requests, as though our rational awareness cannot fully override the emotional and cognitive commitment we have already made. Imagine a scenario where a charity organization contacts you requesting a substantial donation of $500 to support their cause, knowing full well that most people will refuse such a large request. And then after you decline, they follow immediately with a smaller request for $50, which suddenly feels quite reasonable by comparison. This is the door-in-the-face technique, a persuasion strategy that operates through the deliberate presentation of an initial request so large or demanding that rejection becomes almost inevitable, followed swiftly by a more modest request that appears far more acceptable after the contrast with what came before. The mechanism underlying this psychological phenomenon rests on several interconnected principles that govern how we process social interactions and maintain consistency within our own behavior and self-perception. When we reject the first request, we experience a subtle discomfort, a minor cognitive dissonance that arises from declining someone's direct appeal, and this creates a psychological pressure to balance our refusal by demonstrating that we are indeed reasonable and willing to help in some capacity. Additionally, the contrast effect plays a crucial role, as the second request suddenly appears diminished and manageable when measured against the initial demand, making compliance seem like a fair compromise rather than capitulation. You observe this technique operating across countless domains of human interaction, from sales negotiations where inflated initial prices make the eventual discount seem generous, to workplace requests where supervisors ask for unrealistic commitments before settling for what they actually needed all along, to personal relationships where family members might request a major favor knowing will be refused before asking for something smaller that the refusal has now prepared them to accept. Imagine walking into a clothing store where a jacket is displayed with a price tag of $299, crossed out with a red line, and next to it a new price of $149 in bold letters. You feel an immediate sense of value and opportunity, believing you have discovered an exceptional bargain, when in reality you have no way of knowing whether that original price was ever genuine or if the jacket is worth anywhere near either figure. This is anchoring bias, the powerful cognitive phenomenon whereby the first number or piece of information we encounter becomes a reference point that disproportionately influences all subsequent judgments and decisions. The initial anchor acts like an invisible weight that pulls our perception toward it, even when we consciously recognize that this first piece of data may be completely arbitrary or manipulated. Real estate agents understand this principle profoundly, often showing clients the most expensive properties first so that subsequent homes seem more reasonably priced by comparison. A used car salesman might begin negotiations at an inflated figure, knowing that even if the final price drops significantly, the buyer's perception of fairness has already been anchored to that higher starting point. Salary negotiations follow this same pattern, where the person who suggests the first number gains a substantial psychological advantage because all counteroffers become variations on that initial anchor rather than independent assessments of true value. The mechanism underlying this bias operates through a process of insufficient adjustment, wherein our minds use the anchor as a starting point and then make only small corrections away from it, typically underestimating how far we should move. We fail to fully recognize how arbitrary the anchor actually is, treating it instead as if it contains meaningful information about the true value or state of whatever we are evaluating. Imagine you are shopping for a new winter coat and you try on a particularly expensive designer piece that costs $800. You look in the mirror and feel uncertain about the purchase, wondering if it truly justifies such an expenditure. Then the salesperson brings you another coat, this one clearly of lower quality, made from thinner material with visible seams that appear poorly stitched and priced at $300. When you put on the expensive coat again after seeing this alternative, it suddenly feels like an exceptional bargain, a wise investment, almost a steal. The expensive coat hasn't changed in any objective way, yet your perception of its value has shifted dramatically. This phenomenon is the contrast effect, and it reveals something fundamental about how our minds evaluate and compare information. Our brains do not assess things in absolute terms based on some universal standard of quality or value. Instead, we evaluate almost everything relative to what we have recently encountered. When we are exposed to something that is worse than our current option, that option appears better than it actually is. When we encounter something superior, our current choice suddenly seems inadequate. The contrast effect operates across nearly every domain of human judgment, from how we perceive prices and quality to how we evaluate people's attractiveness, intelligence, and social status. A moderately attractive person standing next to a very unattractive person will seem significantly more beautiful than that same person standing beside a very attractive individual. A person of average intelligence will seem sharp and articulate after conversing with someone who struggles to form coherent thoughts, yet that same person might appear intellectually limited after speaking with a brilliant scholar. This mechanism persists because our minds evolved to make quick, efficient comparisons rather than to establish fixed absolute values. In environments where resources were limited and decisions needed to be made rapidly, comparing relative value often proved more useful than attempting to measure absolute quality. Consider for a moment the experience of finding $20 in an old jacket pocket versus the experience of losing $20 from your wallet, and you will immediately understand the asymmetry of human emotion that defines this principle. Most people report that the pain of losing $20 feels approximately twice as intense as the pleasure of finding $20, despite the monetary value being identical in both scenarios. This discrepancy between the way we experience gains and losses reveals something fundamental about how our minds are constructed, something that economist Daniel Kahneman discovered through decades of research into decision-making behavior. When we stand at the threshold of a decision, we do not weigh potential gains and losses equally on some perfectly balanced psychological scale, but rather we weight losses much more heavily, assigning them nearly double the emotional significance of equivalent gains. This means that when confronted with a choice between accepting a sure thing or taking a risk that might yield greater rewards, most people will choose the safer option not because the mathematics favor it, but because the potential loss looms so much larger in their imagination than the potential gain. We see this principle operating everywhere throughout human life, from the way people cling to their current jobs despite being unfulfilled, fearing the loss of steady income far more than they desire the gain of a more meaningful career, to the way investors hold on to losing stocks hoping they will recover rather than accepting the loss and reinvesting in something more promising. The mechanism underlying this tendency appears to be rooted in our evolutionary past, where the consequences of losing necessary resources like food or shelter were far more severe and immediate than the benefits of gaining extra resources. Thus, natural selection favored those whose psychology made them extremely cautious about losses. Imagine a person who signs up for a gym membership in January with genuine enthusiasm and optimism about transforming their body, and yet by March they find themselves paying for a service they barely use, continuing to rationalize that they will eventually return with renewed dedication. This pattern repeats month after month, year after year, even as the unused membership becomes a quiet source of mild embarrassment rather than motivation. The psychological mechanism at work here is commitment consistency, a principle that suggests once we have made a decision or taken a stand on something, we encounter internal and external pressure to behave consistently with that commitment in order to justify our earlier choice and maintain a coherent self-image. When we commit to something publicly, write it down, tell others about it, or invest resources into it, we unconsciously begin to reorganize our beliefs and behaviors to align with that commitment, not necessarily because the commitment remains valid or beneficial, but because our minds prioritize internal consistency above all else. We become invested in being the kind of person who follows through, the kind of person who was right in their initial decision, and we will often go to remarkable lengths to maintain that fiction in our own minds and in the eyes of others. The truly curious aspect of this principle is how it persists even when we are consciously aware of its operation, even when we can clearly articulate that continuing with our original commitment serves us poorly and that changing course would be more rational and advantageous. We have normalized the discomfort of staying true to obsolete decisions as a virtue, calling it loyalty or dedication, when it is often simply the mind's preference for consistency over growth. Imagine walking into a doctor's office where a man in a white coat tells you that you need an expensive treatment that you've never heard of before, and without hesitation, you nod and agree to schedule the procedure, trusting his expertise implicitly without seeking a second opinion or conducting any research of your own. Or consider a scenario where a news anchor presents information with absolute certainty, and millions of viewers accept it as truth simply because the person is speaking from behind a desk with apparent credentials and confidence. This is authority bias in action, a cognitive phenomenon where we automatically assign greater weight, credibility, and influence to the opinions and directives of people we perceive as authorities in their respective fields. The mechanism operates through a deeply ingrained psychological shortcut that our brains have developed over generations of human existence, where following the guidance of experienced leaders and experts genuinely did improve survival rates and outcomes. When we encounter someone with perceived authority, whether derived from professional credentials, institutional affiliation, years of experience, or simply the confidence they project, our critical thinking faculties tend to relax and become less vigilant. Our minds essentially delegate the responsibility of evaluation to this perceived expert, reasoning that they have specialized knowledge we lack, and that trusting them is more efficient than undertaking the difficult work of independent analysis. What makes authority bias particularly persistent despite its logical vulnerabilities is that it remains deeply embedded in how we structure society and institutions, where hierarchies of expertise genuinely do exist and often serve important functions. We've normalized the outsourcing of judgment to authorities in medicine, law, education, and governance, because in many cases this system does work and does produce better outcomes than untrained individuals making decisions in complex domains. Imagine you are sitting in a meeting where your supervisor presents a new workplace policy that employees are strictly forbidden from checking personal messages during work hours, with the threat of disciplinary action for violations. In that exact moment, despite having rarely thought about checking your phone before, you suddenly feel an overwhelming urge to do precisely that, and the restriction itself becomes psychologically appealing in a way it never was before. This is the reactance effect in its purest form, a phenomenon where the perceived loss of personal freedom generates a powerful motivation to restore that freedom, even when the restricted behavior held little intrinsic value to you originally. The psychological mechanism operates through a fundamental human need for autonomy and self-determination, a core motivation that drives us to feel like agents of our own choices rather than subjects controlled by external forces. When someone or something attempts to limit our behavioral options, our minds register this as a threat to our sense of control and independence, triggering an emotional response that pushes us toward the restricted option as a means of psychologically reasserting our freedom and agency. This internal resistance mechanism is so deeply rooted in human psychology that it activates almost automatically, operating beneath our conscious awareness much of the time, and it affects people across all demographics and belief systems with remarkable consistency. What makes reactance particularly intriguing is how it persists even when we rationally understand that the restriction exists for legitimate reasons, whether for health, safety, or institutional function. We find ourselves caught between our logical understanding that certain rules make sense and our primal emotional response to having our choices limited, creating an internal conflict that manifests as increased desire for the forbidden option. Imagine walking into a coffee shop on a cold winter morning, and before you even look at the menu, the barista mentions that their soup of the day is a warm, hearty tomato bisque. Moments later, when you glance at the drink options, you find yourself drawn not to the iced coffee or the cold brew, but instead to the hot chocolate and steaming lattes. The mention of warmth has subtly influenced your perception and your choices without your conscious awareness, and you might never realize that this seemingly natural preference was actually seeded by the words you heard just moments before. This phenomenon is called the priming effect, and it represents one of the most pervasive yet invisible forces that shape our thoughts, decisions, and behaviors throughout our daily lives. The psychological mechanism at work here is surprisingly straightforward yet remarkably powerful. When we encounter a stimulus, whether it is a word, an image, a smell, or a concept, our brain activates related neural pathways and associated memories and emotions. This activation does not disappear immediately, but rather lingers in our mind, making those activated concepts more mentally available and more likely to influence our subsequent thoughts and actions. The barista's mention of warmth activated your warm-related neural networks, making hot beverages seem more appealing and more accessible in your thinking at that moment. Your brain was essentially primed, like a pump being prepared to draw water, and the direction of that priming determined which way your thoughts would flow and which decisions would feel more natural and intuitive. What makes the priming effect particularly remarkable is that it operates almost entirely below the threshold of conscious awareness. You did not consciously think about how the barista's words were influencing your choice, and if someone asked you why you chose hot chocolate instead of iced coffee, you might attribute it to the cold weather or to a genuine craving, never suspecting that your preference had been subtly nudged by linguistic priming moments before. Imagine two versions of the same medical procedure being described to you by a doctor, and notice how your emotional response shifts entirely based on the language used to present it. In the first scenario, you are told that the procedure has a 90% survival rate, and you feel reasonably confident and willing to proceed. In the second scenario, presented moments later, you are told that the procedure has a 10% mortality rate, and suddenly you feel anxious and hesitant, even though mathematically these statements describe the exact same outcome. This is the framing effect, and it demonstrates that our decisions and judgments are not determined by objective reality alone, but rather by how information is presented to us, the linguistic container into which facts are poured, and the emotional associations that accompany different ways of describing the same underlying truth. The mechanism at work here involves the way our brains process information through mental shortcuts and emotional associations. When information is framed positively, emphasizing gains and benefits, our brains activate different neural pathways than when the same information is framed negatively, emphasizing losses and risks. This is not a conscious choice we make. It happens automatically and instantaneously. Our brains are wired to be loss-averse, meaning we feel the pain of losing something roughly twice as intensely as we feel the pleasure of gaining something of equal value, and this asymmetry in our emotional response can be manipulated through the simple act of reframing. What is remarkable about the framing effect is that despite understanding this principle intellectually, we remain remarkably susceptible to it even when we know exactly what is happening. A person can be told that a frame is being applied, can understand the mathematics perfectly, and can still find themselves feeling differently about the situation based on how it is presented. Imagine walking into a social gathering where you notice someone who appears moderately attractive at first glance, but then you observe that several other people seem drawn to them, laughing at their jokes, maintaining close proximity, and displaying obvious signs of interest and approval. Suddenly, that person becomes noticeably more attractive in your perception, and you find yourself more intrigued by them than you were moments before when you first arrived. This phenomenon is the preselection effect, a powerful psychological mechanism where the apparent selection or approval of others significantly influences our own evaluation and desirability assessment of another person. The human mind has evolved to use social proof as a shortcut for determining value, operating under the logical premise that if multiple individuals have already vetted someone as desirable or worthy of attention, then that person likely possesses genuine qualities worth our consideration and investment. This cognitive efficiency system worked well throughout our evolutionary history when information was scarce and tribal approval carried real survival implications, suggesting that someone chosen by the group had proven their worth through demonstrated competence, reliability, or genetic fitness. However, in modern contexts saturated with deliberate social engineering, curated online personas, and manufactured popularity metrics, this ancient heuristic persists with remarkable stubbornness, leading us to attribute attraction and value to people largely based on how many other people appear to want their attention rather than on any objective assessment of their actual character, capabilities, or compatibility with us personally. We have normalized this bias so thoroughly that we construct entire industries and cultural systems around it, from celebrity endorsements to social media follower counts to the strategic display of group dynamics in dating and networking contexts, all tacitly acknowledging that human attraction operates less on individual judgment and more on the reflected approval of anonymous multitudes. The push-pull dynamic is a pattern of behavior where one person alternates between showing interest and withdrawing attention, creating a cycle that paradoxically deepens another person's investment and desire. Picture a romantic scenario where someone you care about is warm and attentive one day, sharing intimate conversations and making future plans, but then becomes distant and cold the next day, taking hours to respond to messages or canceling plans without explanation. This unpredictability creates a profound psychological effect on the receiving end, where the person finds themselves constantly trying to recapture the positive moments and desperately seeking to understand what went wrong, thereby investing more emotional energy and attention into the relationship than they would in a consistently warm interaction. The mechanism behind this lies in the brain's reward system and our deep psychological need for consistency and closure. When we experience intermittent reinforcement, where rewards come unpredictably rather than consistently, our brains actually become more engaged and desperate to solve the puzzle of when the next reward will arrive. This is the same principle that makes gambling so addictive and slot machines so psychologically compelling, because the variable ratio schedule of reinforcement creates stronger behavioral patterns than constant, predictable rewards ever could. The person being pulled and pushed begins to ruminate extensively about their behavior, wondering what they did to cause the withdrawal, and they work harder to earn back the positive attention, essentially training themselves to accept lower standards of treatment in exchange for occasional moments of validation. What is remarkable about this dynamic is how normalized it has become in modern relationships, where we rationalize inconsistent behavior as independence or personal space, rather than recognizing it as a form of emotional manipulation. Imagine you are scrolling through your phone and you encounter a headline that reads, "You won't believe what happened next," or "This one trick will change your life forever." And despite knowing intellectually that these phrases are manipulative and overused, you find yourself compelled to click, to read further, to discover what lies beyond that tantalizing threshold of incomplete information. This is the curiosity gap in action, a psychological phenomenon where our minds become intensely motivated to close the space between what we currently know and what we don't know, what we can see and what remains hidden from view. The mechanism operates on a fundamental level within human cognition, rooted in the way our brains process information and seek pattern completion. When we encounter a gap in our understanding, when we are presented with a puzzle that remains unsolved or a narrative that feels incomplete, our minds automatically generate an uncomfortable state of tension that can only be relieved through the acquisition of missing information. This tension is not merely psychological, but involves genuine neurological activity, as our brains are essentially prediction machines constantly working to anticipate and explain the world around us. And when those predictions are thwarted or left hanging, an actual state of cognitive discomfort emerges that motivates us to seek closure. The curiosity gap is deliberately weaponized across media, marketing, and entertainment industries, where content creators craft headlines, trailers, and opening scenes specifically designed to create this gap, knowing that the human mind will prioritize filling it above almost everything else. Yet despite our growing awareness of these tactics, despite the countless think pieces written about clickbait and manipulative headlines, we continue to fall prey to this mechanism again and again, clicking on content we suspect is sensationalized, watching videos that promise revelations we doubt will materialize, and remaining engaged with narratives that deliberately withhold information to maintain our attention. Consider the moment when someone shares a fear, a failure, or a moment of deep uncertainty with another person, and in return, that person responds not with judgment but with their own confession, their own admission of struggle, and suddenly a profound shift occurs in the relationship dynamic. This is the vulnerability loop, a reciprocal cycle where the expression of authentic weakness creates a safe container for others to express theirs, which in turn deepens the initial speaker's sense of being truly understood and accepted. When you reveal something genuine about yourself, something that carries real risk of rejection, you are essentially offering another person a gift wrapped in honesty, and the psychological response is nearly automatic. They feel obligated, not in a burdensome way, but in a deeply human way to reciprocate with their own truth. This reciprocation is not a calculated exchange. Rather, it emerges from the fundamental human need to be seen and accepted as a complete person, flaws and all. The mechanism underlying vulnerability loops rests on the principle that humans are drawn toward authenticity and repelled by perceived fakeness, and when someone demonstrates that they are willing to be imperfect in your presence, it grants implicit permission for you to do the same. Once this pattern begins, it tends to accelerate, creating increasingly intimate exchanges that forge bonds far stronger than any amount of surface-level conversation could achieve. The paradox is that in a culture that often equates strength with invulnerability and success with the absence of struggle, vulnerability loops remain profoundly powerful, yet underutilized tools for human connection. We have somehow normalized the hiding of our struggles while simultaneously craving genuine connection, creating a strange tension where people sit isolated behind carefully constructed personas, waiting for someone else to risk being first, to crack open their facade and invite others to do the same. When two people meet for the first time, there exists an unspoken dance of vulnerability that unfolds with remarkable predictability. Imagine a scenario where one person shares a moderate personal detail about themselves, perhaps mentioning a minor failure or an embarrassing moment from their past, and notice how the other person feels almost compelled to respond in kind by sharing something equally personal in return. This tendency to match the depth and intimacy of another person's self-disclosure is the phenomenon known as reciprocal self-disclosure, and it operates as one of the most powerful forces in building human connection and attraction. When someone reveals something about themselves to us, we experience an almost automatic inclination to balance the emotional ledger by opening up in comparable ways, creating a sense of mutual understanding and trust that would otherwise take significantly longer to develop through surface-level conversation alone. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior appears to be rooted in our fundamental need for fairness and social equilibrium. When another person extends themselves through vulnerability, we interpret this as both a sign of trust in us and an implicit invitation to deepen our connection, which triggers a reciprocal response that feels natural and necessary for maintaining social balance. Our brains have evolved to recognize that relationships built on mutual vulnerability are more stable and reliable than those based on one-sided disclosure, and therefore we unconsciously work to establish this equilibrium through matching behavior. Additionally, when someone shares personal information with us, we tend to like them more as a result, and we simultaneously assume that they will like us more if we reciprocate, creating a positive feedback loop that draws us closer together. Despite the logical foundation of this principle, we continue to experience surprise and delight when reciprocal self-disclosure occurs naturally in conversation, as though it were a spontaneous gesture of intimacy rather than the predictable neurological pattern it truly is. Imagine walking into a room where everyone is laughing and smiling, and within moments, you find yourself grinning even if you arrived feeling neutral or slightly down, or consider entering a space where tension hangs heavy in the air and people move quietly with furrowed brows, and gradually your own shoulders tense and your mood dampens without anyone saying a word to you directly. This phenomenon is emotional contagion, the remarkable psychological process through which emotions spread from person to person like an invisible current that flows beneath conscious awareness and rational control. The mechanism operates primarily through mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that same action, creating a neural bridge between observer and observed that allows us to internally simulate the emotional experiences we witness in others. Beyond this neurological foundation, emotional contagion travels through multiple channels, including facial expressions that our brains automatically mimic, vocal tones and speech patterns that unconsciously influence our own patterns of communication, and even physical proximity, which amplifies the intensity of emotional transmission through increased exposure to microexpressions and pheromones. When we see someone's genuine smile or distressed expression, our facial muscles subtly activate in sympathetic response, and this muscular mimicry sends feedback signals to our brain that literally create the emotional state being mirrored, a process so fundamental that even viewing photographs or videos of emotional expressions can trigger weak versions of this response. What proves most striking about emotional contagion is how thoroughly it operates outside our deliberate control, despite our modern understanding of its mechanisms and our intellectual awareness that we are being influenced by others' emotional states. Imagine walking through a crowded space and finding yourself drawn toward certain faces without quite knowing why. There exists a subtle but powerful phenomenon wherein people with more symmetrical facial features consistently receive higher ratings of attractiveness, trustworthiness, and competence from observers across virtually every culture and demographic group studied. When the left and right sides of a face align more evenly, with balanced cheekbones, a centered nose, proportional eyes, and an aligned jawline, observers report feeling a greater sense of aesthetic appeal and interpersonal comfort. This symmetry operates beneath conscious awareness for most people, yet it influences dating preferences, hiring decisions, friendship formation, and even how much patience others extend during initial interactions. The psychological mechanism underlying this preference appears rooted in evolutionary biology, as facial symmetry has historically served as a marker of genetic health and developmental stability. A symmetrical face suggests that an organism has managed to maintain proper development despite environmental stressors and genetic challenges, and therefore may carry genes that produce healthier offspring. Our brains, shaped by millions of years of natural selection, remain exquisitely attuned to these subtle markers of biological fitness, even though most modern humans no longer consciously prioritize reproductive outcomes when selecting romantic partners or colleagues. What makes this phenomenon particularly compelling is how completely it persists despite our intellectual awareness of its arbitrariness. We live in an era of unprecedented visual media exposure, where asymmetrical faces appear everywhere in entertainment and art, yet the preference for symmetry remains stubbornly constant. People invest significant time, money, and emotional energy into cosmetic procedures designed to increase facial symmetry, and research consistently demonstrates that this investment yields measurable social returns in the form of improved treatment from others. Throughout human history and across virtually every culture, there exists a curious pattern in which certain body proportions are deemed universally attractive, and among these proportions, the ratio between waist circumference and hip circumference has emerged as one of the most studied and most consistently valued markers of physical desirability. Research has repeatedly demonstrated that individuals, particularly men when evaluating women, show a striking preference for a waist-hip ratio of approximately 0.7, meaning a waist that is roughly 70% the circumference of the hips. And this preference appears with such regularity across different populations and time periods that researchers have proposed it reflects something fundamental about human attraction and evolutionary psychology rather than arbitrary cultural conditioning. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is grounded in biological signaling, as this particular ratio is associated with fertility, health, hormonal balance, and reproductive capability, with women displaying this ratio typically having optimal estrogen to androgen levels and lower rates of certain diseases, suggesting that ancestral humans who were attracted to this proportion may have unconsciously selected partners more likely to produce healthy offspring and pass on their genes successfully. Yet despite this evolutionary explanation carrying considerable weight in scientific literature, the phenomenon persists in ways that transcend pure biological logic. For fashion industries, advertising campaigns, and social media platforms have amplified and distorted this preference far beyond its original function, creating artificial standards that often become impossible or unhealthy to achieve, and women expend tremendous resources through cosmetic surgery, extreme dieting, and rigorous exercise regimens specifically targeting this ratio, even when their overall health and well-being would benefit from different body compositions. Consider the moment when you first hear someone speak, whether in person, over the telephone, or through a recorded message, and notice how immediately your perception of that person begins to form based almost entirely on the acoustic properties of their voice, particularly the pitch at which they communicate. Research across multiple decades has consistently demonstrated that listeners exhibit strong preferences for certain voice pitches, and these preferences operate largely beneath conscious awareness, shaping our judgments about attractiveness, trustworthiness, competence, and authority before we have processed a single word of actual content. Lower-pitched voices, particularly in men, tend to be associated with greater dominance, maturity, and leadership potential, while higher-pitched voices in women are often perceived as more approachable, youthful, and nurturing, yet these associations vary significantly across cultures and contexts. The mechanism underlying this preference appears rooted in evolutionary biology, as pitch can indicate physical size and hormonal status, creating unconscious links between acoustic qualities and reproductive fitness or survival advantage, which our ancestral brains learned to prioritize. Additionally, voices that fall within a moderate range, neither too high nor too low, tend to be perceived as more credible and persuasive, suggesting that extremes in either direction activate some internal alarm system that makes listeners skeptical or uncomfortable. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is how we have constructed entire professional hierarchies and social systems around these pitch preferences, with lower-voiced individuals often ascending to leadership positions more frequently regardless of their actual qualifications, while higher-voiced individuals face systematic disadvantages in domains requiring perceived authority. Consider the moment when you walk into a room and catch a familiar fragrance, perhaps the scent of someone you care about deeply, and immediately you feel a wave of emotion, comfort, or even desire wash over you without conscious thought or deliberate analysis. This is scent attraction in its most fundamental form, operating beneath the surface of rational decision-making and working directly through our most ancient neurological pathways. The human sense of smell connects directly to the limbic system, the emotional and memory center of our brain, bypassing the logical processing corridors that govern our other senses, which means a particular aroma can trigger profound emotional responses, influence our perception of attractiveness, and shape our behavioral choices in ways we rarely acknowledge or fully understand. When we encounter someone wearing a signature scent, our brain begins processing complex information about their health, genetic compatibility, emotional state, and even their socioeconomic status, all through the invisible language of molecular compounds floating through the air. This olfactory attraction extends far beyond human interaction, influencing how we perceive spaces, products, and experiences. As retailers and designers have long understood, strategically implementing scents in stores and environments to encourage purchasing behavior and emotional attachment. The mechanism operates through something called the major histocompatibility complex, a genetic region that influences body odor and mate selection, suggesting that our preferences for certain scents may be evolutionarily designed to help us choose partners with complementary immune systems and genetic diversity. Yet despite understanding these mechanisms intellectually, we continue to grant scent an almost mystical power over our choices and emotions, treating fragrance as a luxury indulgence rather than recognizing it as a sophisticated biological communication system that fundamentally shapes our attractions and decisions in ways we can neither fully control nor completely escape. Consider for a moment the faces you find most attractive in your daily life, perhaps the photographs of celebrities that catch your eye or the people you meet who seem to draw admiration from those around you. There exists a curious and persistent phenomenon where faces that are mathematically average, that is to say faces whose features fall closest to the mean measurements of a population, tend to be rated as more attractive than faces with more extreme or unusual characteristics. And researchers have conducted studies where they composite multiple faces together using digital technology, averaging out the individual variations into a single unified face. Observers consistently rate these averaged faces as more beautiful and appealing than most of the individual faces that were used to create them. This effect holds true across different cultures, different time periods, and different demographic groups, suggesting something fundamental about human perception at work. The mechanism behind this phenomenon appears to be rooted in several overlapping psychological principles. First, there is the mere exposure effect, wherein faces that more closely resemble the average faces we encounter repeatedly throughout our lives feel more familiar to us, and familiarity breeds preference and comfort. Second, average faces may unconsciously signal genetic diversity and health, as extreme features can sometimes be associated with genetic abnormalities or developmental irregularities. Third, our brains find mathematical harmony and symmetry satisfying, and average faces tend to possess better overall proportionality and balance. Yet despite understanding this principle intellectually, we continue to celebrate and elevate faces that deviate markedly from the average, promoting uniqueness and distinctiveness as the ultimate markers of beauty, while simultaneously being drawn to the mathematical mediocrity of averaged features. This contradiction persists in our culture, shaping how we construct ideals of beauty and attractiveness. Consider walking through any public space where couples gather, and you will notice a curious pattern emerging across the landscape of human relationships. People tend to pair with others who are approximately equal to them in overall attractiveness. A person of average appearance typically finds themselves in romantic partnerships with someone of similarly average appearance, while exceptionally attractive individuals more frequently form bonds with other exceptionally attractive people, and this tendency holds true across every demographic and geographic region one might examine. The matching hypothesis, developed through decades of psychological research beginning in the 1960s, suggests that individuals pursue romantic partners whose level of physical attractiveness roughly corresponds to their own, creating a sort of equilibrium in the dating marketplace where value is exchanged in relatively equal proportions. The mechanism underlying this pattern appears to operate through a combination of realistic assessment and fear of rejection. People learn relatively early in their social development that approaching someone significantly more attractive than themselves carries a high probability of dismissal, and rather than repeatedly expose themselves to the psychological pain of rejection, they unconsciously gravitate toward potential partners who fall within what they perceive as their own attractiveness range, thereby maximizing their chances of acceptance while avoiding the emotional cost of overreaching. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where individuals become comfortable seeking matches with those deemed roughly equivalent, and over time this pattern becomes so normalized and integrated into how we navigate romance that it barely registers as a conscious choice anymore. The Romeo-Juliet effect describes a psychological phenomenon wherein external opposition to a romantic relationship actually strengthens the emotional bond between the two people involved, rather than diminishing it. When parents disapprove of a couple's relationship, when friends voice concerns, or when social circumstances create barriers to being together, the individuals often find themselves more deeply committed to one another, more passionate about their connection, and more convinced of the authenticity of their love. The very resistance that one might logically expect to weaken attraction instead seems to amplify it, creating an almost paradoxical intensification of romantic feelings precisely at the moment when practical obstacles should rationally encourage reconsideration. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through several interconnected psychological processes. First, external pressure triggers what psychologists call reactance, a motivational state in which people feel compelled to reassert their autonomy and freedom when those freedoms are perceived as threatened, and romantic choice represents one of the most fundamental expressions of personal freedom available to individuals. When someone attempts to control or restrict a person's romantic options, that person naturally resists by strengthening their commitment to the forbidden choice, transforming an abstract preference into a deeply felt assertion of independence. Additionally, opposition activates what is known as cognitive dissonance, whereby the internal conflict between disapproval from trusted sources and one's own romantic feelings forces a person to justify their choice more vigorously, ultimately convincing themselves more thoroughly of the relationship's value through the process of generating arguments in its defense. Furthermore, shared adversity creates powerful bonding experiences, as couples facing external obstacles often position themselves as allies against the world, deepening their sense of unity and mutual reliance. Imagine sitting across from someone in a coffee shop, and without either of you consciously realizing it, you both lean forward at the same moment, you mirror the tilt of their head, and when they take a sip of their drink, your hand drifts toward your own cup in an almost identical gesture. This phenomenon, known as nonverbal synchrony, occurs when two people unconsciously align their body language, facial expressions, breathing patterns, and even vocal rhythms during interaction, creating a subtle choreography of mirroring that happens entirely beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. The person who is naturally good at this synchronization often finds that others feel more comfortable in their presence, trust them more readily, and are more likely to be influenced by their ideas and suggestions, even though nothing explicit has been said and no logical argument has been presented. The mechanism underlying this effect appears to be rooted in our evolutionary history as social creatures who needed to read and predict the behavior of others in their group. When we mirror someone's nonverbal cues, we are essentially running a simulation of their internal state in our own bodies and brains, creating a form of neural resonance that generates feelings of rapport and connection. This mirroring activates mirror neurons in the observer's brain, the same neural structures that fire when we perform an action ourselves, effectively allowing us to embody the other person's experience and intentions without needing to consciously decode what they are feeling or thinking. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is that despite our modern understanding of psychology and human behavior, we continue to allow these unconscious nonverbal patterns to guide our judgments, our trust, and our willingness to be influenced by others, rarely questioning whether the comfort we feel around someone who synchronizes well with us is based on genuine compatibility or merely an illusion created by skillful mirroring. The proximity effect is a fundamental principle of human attraction and relationship formation that operates so quietly and persistently that we rarely notice its influence on our lives. When you spend time in close physical proximity to another person, whether in an office space, a classroom, a shared apartment, or even on a commute, your brain begins to form associations between that person and your daily environment. You start to see them regularly, your paths cross naturally, and you develop familiarity through repeated exposure. Over time, this repeated contact creates a sense of comfort and connection that has nothing to do with whether you initially liked or disliked the person. The more frequently you encounter someone, the more your mind categorizes them as part of your normal social landscape, and this categorization gradually transforms into positive regard. People who sit near you in class become your friends, coworkers who share your floor become confidants, neighbors you pass in hallways become trusted acquaintances. The mechanism behind this effect lies in a cognitive process called the mere exposure effect, where familiarity breeds liking through the simple act of repeated perception. Your brain interprets familiarity as safety, and safety as comfort, and comfort eventually as affection. This happens largely outside your conscious awareness, which makes it particularly powerful and difficult to resist. What makes the proximity effect particularly fascinating is that it persists even when we intellectually understand how it works. We may recognize that we are drawn to someone simply because they sit next to us or live nearby, yet we continue to act as though our attraction stems from deeper compatibility or genuine connection. We construct narratives around these relationships that justify our proximity-based feelings, convincing ourselves that there is something special about this person beyond mere physical closeness. Distance, conversely, erodes even the strongest relationships through the same mechanism working in reverse. Consider the moment when you meet someone at a social gathering, and within minutes you discover that they share your taste in music, your hometown, or perhaps even your obscure hobby of collecting vintage postcards. There is an immediate warmth that follows this discovery, a sense of comfort and connection that seems to materialize almost instantaneously. You find yourself naturally drawn to this person, wanting to spend more time in their presence, to learn more about them, and to deepen the relationship. This phenomenon occurs across countless contexts, in romantic relationships where partners discover shared values, in friendships that blossom when people realize they attended the same university, or in professional settings where colleagues bond over similar work philosophies. The attraction feels organic and authentic, as though you have recognized a kindred spirit. The psychological mechanism underlying this widespread human tendency is rooted in what researchers have identified as similarity attraction, a principle stating that we are naturally inclined to prefer, trust, and feel drawn toward people who resemble us in meaningful ways. This preference operates across multiple dimensions, including personality traits, values, beliefs, backgrounds, and even physical appearance. When we encounter similarity in another person, our brains interpret this as validation of our own choices and perspectives, which generates a comfortable neurological state. Similarity reduces cognitive friction and creates what psychologists call a sense of social proof, evidence that our way of being is correct simply because another person shares it. Despite the fact that human growth and enrichment often come from exposure to different perspectives and experiences, we continue to organize our social lives around people who are fundamentally like us. We join clubs and communities populated by those with matching interests, we gravitate toward romantic partners with compatible backgrounds, and we instinctively trust people whose values align with our own. When two people come together in romantic partnership, there exists a profound tendency for their individual characteristics to organize themselves into patterns of mutual completion, where the strengths of one person naturally compensate for the perceived weaknesses of the other, creating an illusion of perfect balance and destiny. Consider the scenario where an introverted individual who excels at deep listening and careful observation pairs with an extroverted partner who thrives in social situations and effortlessly navigates crowded rooms, and both partners begin to believe that they were somehow specifically designed by fate to fill the voids in each other's personalities. The introverted person gradually surrenders their own capacity to build social connections, reasoning that their partner handles this domain more naturally, while the extroverted person similarly relinquishes their own capacity for reflection and introspection, content to let their quieter partner occupy that psychological space. This psychological mechanism operates through a process sometimes called the principle of complementary attraction, wherein we are drawn not to people who are identical to ourselves, but rather to those who embody qualities we either lack or have suppressed, because their presence provides us with a sense of wholeness that we struggle to find within ourselves. The brain unconsciously registers this feeling of completion as evidence of love, compatibility, and rightness, even though what is actually occurring is a subtle abdication of personal responsibility and growth, as we outsource the development of our own underdeveloped traits to another fallible human being. Consider walking into a coffee shop and ordering from a barista whose name tag reads Sarah, and then later that same week, you encounter another person named Sarah at a networking event, and suddenly you feel a peculiar sense of familiarity and warmth toward this stranger simply because she shares a name with someone you already know and like. This phenomenon of name recognition operates as one of the most subtle yet pervasive forces in human psychology, shaping our preferences, our judgments, and our willingness to trust or affiliate with others in ways we rarely acknowledge or even notice. When we encounter a name that is familiar to us, whether because we know someone by that name, because we have heard it frequently in our cultural context, or because it belongs to a public figure we admire, our brains trigger a cascade of positive associations that transfer onto the new person bearing that name, even though they are complete strangers and share nothing but nomenclature. The mechanism underlying this effect stems from what psychologists call the fluency heuristic, which is our tendency to interpret familiarity as a signal of safety, trustworthiness, and positive value. Names that are easy to pronounce, that sound pleasant to our ears, and that we have encountered many times before create a sense of cognitive ease, and our minds interpret this ease as evidence that something is good, reliable, or worth our attention. Furthermore, when we meet someone whose name matches someone we know, our brain automatically activates the neural pathways and emotional associations connected to that familiar name, creating an unconscious transfer of sentiment that colors our perception of the stranger before us. This process occurs entirely outside our conscious awareness, operating beneath the threshold of our rational judgment, which is precisely what makes it so powerful and so persistent. When two people engage in conversation, and one maintains a steady, unwavering gaze into the eyes of the other, something remarkable occurs beneath the surface of that simple human interaction, a phenomenon so deeply rooted in our evolutionary psychology that we rarely pause to consider its mechanisms or origins. The person receiving this sustained eye contact often experiences a heightened sense of attention, a feeling of being truly seen and acknowledged, which creates an immediate shift in how they perceive the person looking at them, whether that perception is one of confidence, trustworthiness, dominance, or genuine affection. This happens because sustained eye contact triggers a cascade of neurological responses in the brain, activating regions associated with social cognition and emotional processing, while simultaneously releasing oxytocin, the neurochemical often called the bonding hormone, which deepens our sense of connection and trust toward the other person. Throughout human evolution, the ability to maintain eye contact served as a reliable indicator of honesty and confidence, since a person who was lying or attempting deception would instinctively look away, their nervous system betraying their dishonest intent, and thus our ancestors learned to interpret steady eye contact as a signal of sincerity and strength. In modern contexts, we have inherited and internalized these ancient associations so thoroughly that sustained eye contact continues to confer social advantages and perceived trustworthiness even in circumstances where the evolutionary logic no longer applies, such as when a public speaker maintains eye contact with an audience member to appear more compelling, or when someone in a job interview locks eyes with an interviewer to seem more genuine and capable. Consider the moment when a salesperson places a gentle hand on your shoulder during a conversation, or when a political candidate briefly touches your arm while speaking to you at a public event, or when a healthcare professional holds your hand for an extra second while delivering news. And notice how these small physical contacts seem to shift something fundamental in your perception of the interaction and the person initiating it. Strategic touch operates on a profound level of human psychology, where the simplest and most primitive form of communication, direct physical contact, bypasses our rational filters and speaks directly to our emotional and neurological systems in ways that words alone cannot accomplish. When another person makes deliberate physical contact with us, our brains release oxytocin, a neurochemical associated with trust, bonding, and increased susceptibility to suggestion, and simultaneously our guard naturally lowers because touch is fundamentally associated with safety, care, and intimacy in our earliest developmental experiences. The strategist understands that a brief, appropriate touch conveys confidence, sincerity, and warmth in a way that speaking those qualities can never truly replicate. And this nonverbal communication creates a temporary state of psychological openness in the recipient where they become more receptive to influence, more likely to agree with requests, and more inclined to view the person touching them as trustworthy and credible. What makes this principle particularly persistent in human interaction, despite our awareness of it, is that touch remains universally understood as a gesture of good intention, and we have largely normalized its use in professional and social contexts, even though we simultaneously recognize its persuasive power, creating a peculiar blind spot where we acknowledge the mechanism while remaining vulnerable to it nonetheless. Consider the moment when you encounter someone whose face lights up with a smile that reaches their eyes, creating those subtle lines at the corners that reveal authenticity, and notice how your entire nervous system seems to shift into a state of ease and receptivity. This genuine smile, what researchers have termed the Duchenne smile, differs fundamentally from the polite or forced smile we deploy in uncomfortable social situations. Yet both operate on remarkably similar psychological principles that influence how we perceive trustworthiness and approachability in others. When a person smiles with their entire face rather than merely stretching their lips, they unconsciously signal that they possess no threat, no hidden agenda, and that they are genuinely pleased to be in your presence, and this signal travels through multiple channels of human perception simultaneously. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates at several layers of our consciousness and our evolutionary history, beginning with the simple fact that a genuine smile activates more facial muscles than a fake one, particularly the orbicularis oculi muscle around the eyes, which cannot be easily controlled through conscious effort alone. Our brains have developed sophisticated systems for detecting these microexpressions and subtle facial movements, systems so refined that we often recognize authentic warmth before we can articulate why we find someone trustworthy or appealing. When genuine smiling occurs, it triggers mirror neurons in the observer's brain, causing them to subtly mimic the expression and thereby experience a fraction of the emotional state being displayed, creating an invisible bridge of emotional resonance between two people. This mirroring effect enhances rapport and creates a sense of connection that makes the smiling person appear more likable, more credible, and more influential in their communication. Consider the moment when you walk into a room with your shoulders pulled back, your spine extended upright, and your chin held at a level angle toward the horizon, and notice how people around you respond differently than they would if you entered the same space with your shoulders hunched forward, your gaze directed downward, and your frame collapsed inward. This physical positioning creates an immediate psychological impression that operates independently of what you actually say or how competent you truly are in that moment. Yet it shapes the entire trajectory of how others perceive your credibility, authority, and trustworthiness. The research in embodied cognition reveals that your body does not simply express what your mind already believes, but rather your physical posture actively influences your neurochemistry and emotional state, flooding your system with different hormonal balances depending on whether you occupy space expansively or contract yourself into a smaller footprint. When you stand tall with an open chest and squared shoulders, your cortisol levels actually decrease while your testosterone rises slightly, creating a physiological state that genuinely feels more assured and capable, which then projects outward in your voice, your eye contact, and your behavioral choices in ways that others unconsciously detect and respond to with increased deference and respect. The remarkable aspect of this phenomenon is that it functions bidirectionally, meaning that adopting the physical posture of confidence does not merely communicate confidence to observers, but simultaneously creates the internal experience of confidence within yourself, transforming what begins as a postural choice into an authentic psychological shift. Consider the person who purchases a luxury automobile despite having no practical need for enhanced transportation, or the individual who wears a designer watch that costs thousands of dollars when a modest timepiece would serve the identical function of telling time. These are manifestations of status signaling, a deeply embedded human behavior in which we consciously and unconsciously communicate our position within social hierarchies through the acquisition and display of material goods, clothing, accessories, and even the cultivation of particular mannerisms and speech patterns. Status signaling operates on the principle that humans are fundamentally hierarchical creatures who have evolved within group structures, where relative position determines access to resources, reproductive opportunities, and social influence. Throughout evolutionary history, those individuals who could credibly communicate their status and access to resources were more likely to attract favorable mates, secure alliances, and gather followers, while those who could accurately read and respond to status signals were better positioned to navigate complex social environments. This ancient mechanism persists in modern human societies in forms that are often entirely disconnected from survival utility. A person might invest substantially in luxury brands not because the quality materially exceeds that of modest alternatives, but because the recognizable insignia, the exclusive price point, and the cultural associations surrounding those brands communicate membership in a particular social tier. Status signaling extends beyond material objects into the realm of experiences and knowledge, where people display photographs from exotic vacations, reference exclusive memberships, or casually mention educational credentials and professional achievements within conversations. What makes status signaling particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is that it persists even among individuals who intellectually understand that such displays are often hollow, and that material possessions carry no genuine connection to inherent human worth or capability. Consider a scenario where you meet two professionals. One is exceptionally skilled, technically brilliant, and perfectly qualified for a role, yet they communicate with cold precision, maintain emotional distance, and rarely acknowledge your feelings or perspectives. The other possesses adequate but not extraordinary competence, yet they smile genuinely, listen intently to what you say, remember details about your life, and consistently demonstrate they care about your well-being and success. Research in social psychology reveals a remarkable pattern wherein most people will trust, cooperate with, and advocate for the second person far more readily than the first, even when the stakes are high and competence genuinely matters. This phenomenon emerges from a fundamental aspect of human neurobiology and social evolution that prioritizes warmth as a signal of safety and trustworthiness above almost all other factors. Our ancestors survived not because they chose the most technically skilled tribe member to lead them, but because they chose those who demonstrated they cared about the group's collective welfare and could be trusted not to exploit or harm them. When someone displays warmth toward us, our brain interprets this as a signal that we are safe in their presence, that they will not manipulate us for personal gain, and that our interests matter to them, which creates a foundation of trust that is remarkably difficult to build through competence demonstrations alone. The mechanism operates partly through mirror neurons and emotional contagion, wherein warmth is literally felt and reflected back, creating a sense of connection that bonds us at a pre-rational level. Yet this preference persists even when we consciously recognize that it may not serve our interests, suggesting we have normalized the idea that human connection and emotional safety are actually more valuable than raw ability, and perhaps we are right to do so, for a brilliant person who does not care about you remains fundamentally unreliable regardless of their credentials. When you walk into a coffee shop you have visited countless times before, the familiar surroundings barely register in your conscious awareness. Yet the moment a new cafe opens down the street with unfamiliar decor and an untested menu, you feel an irresistible pull to experience it, to explore its offerings, to discover what makes it different from what you already know. This phenomenon, known as novelty attraction, reveals something fundamental about how human attention and desire operate within our psychological architecture. The human brain has evolved to be drawn toward new information, unexpected stimuli, and experiences that deviate from established patterns, because throughout our evolutionary history, novelty often signaled opportunity, potential danger, or resources that required investigation and understanding. When we encounter something genuinely new, whether it is an unfamiliar person, an unexpected situation, or a product we have never encountered before, our brains release dopamine in anticipation of discovery, creating a pleasurable sensation that motivates exploration and engagement. This neurochemical reward system operated as a survival mechanism, encouraging our ancestors to investigate new territories, novel food sources, and unknown individuals who might offer alliance or advantage. The mechanism functions so powerfully because it operates at a level deeper than conscious reasoning, fundamentally rewiring how we allocate our attention and direct our energy towards certain choices over others. What becomes remarkable when examining this tendency across modern life is how persistently novelty captures our focus and desire, even when we intellectually understand that newer does not necessarily mean better, that familiar options have already proven themselves reliable, and that the attraction to novelty often leads us to abandon genuinely satisfying choices in pursuit of marginal improvements that may never materialize. Consider the person who captures your attention not because of what they reveal about themselves, but precisely because of what remains hidden, what you cannot quite understand or predict about their nature or their motivations. This person seems to possess an intriguing quality that keeps drawing your mind back to them, makes you wonder about their thoughts and feelings, compels you to construct narratives in your imagination about who they really are beneath the surface. The mystery appeal operates on a fundamental principle of human psychology, one that suggests our minds are naturally drawn to incomplete information and unresolved patterns. When someone presents themselves in a way that is not entirely transparent, when their actions contain elements that do not align with what we might expect, or when they reveal only fragments of their full personality, we become cognitively engaged in the process of filling in the missing pieces. Our brains interpret this incompleteness as a puzzle waiting to be solved, and we find ourselves investing mental energy and emotional attention in the attempt to decipher what lies beneath. The Zeigarnik Effect, a well-documented phenomenon in psychological research, demonstrates that people tend to remember unfinished tasks and incomplete information more vividly than completed ones, and this same principle applies to our perception of mysterious individuals. We become drawn to them not in spite of our inability to fully understand them, but because of it, because the uncertainty itself creates a kind of cognitive tension that keeps us thinking about them long after an interaction has ended. This appeal persists even when we consciously recognize its illogical nature, even when we understand that the mystery may simply be the result of someone being naturally private or intentionally guarded, rather than possessing some genuine complexity worth unraveling. Consider the peculiar dynamic that unfolds when someone we are interested in becomes less available to us, and how mysteriously their value seems to increase in our perception the moment their time and attention become scarce. A person who responds to every message within seconds suddenly becomes more desirable the moment they begin taking hours or even days to reply, and we find ourselves checking our phones more frequently, refreshing our conversations, waiting with a sense of anticipation that simply did not exist when they were consistently present and responsive. This phenomenon extends far beyond romantic contexts into the realm of professional advancement, social status, and consumer behavior, where the unavailable mentor becomes the one we most wish to learn from, the exclusive social circle becomes the one we most desperately want to join, and the limited edition product becomes far more appealing than its identical counterpart available in unlimited supply. The psychological mechanism underlying selective availability operates through several interconnected layers of human cognition and emotion that reveal something fundamental about how we assign value and meaning to the things and people in our lives. When something or someone is readily available and constantly present, our brains naturally habituate to that stimulus, meaning we cease to register it with the same intensity and emotional weight that we once did. A phenomenon called hedonic adaptation that causes us to take the familiar for granted and stop perceiving its intrinsic worth. However, when availability decreases or becomes uncertain, that scarcity immediately activates our sense of potential loss, triggering a powerful emotional response rooted in our evolutionary need to secure limited resources before they disappear entirely, making us suddenly acutely aware of what we might lose and thus paradoxically increasing our desire for it. When someone we care about is absent from our life, whether through distance, circumstance, or choice, something curious happens within our psychological landscape. The void they leave behind becomes larger and more vivid than their actual presence ever was. We find ourselves thinking about them more intensely, replaying conversations we've had, imagining conversations we might have, and constructing elaborate narratives about what they might be doing or thinking about us in return. The distance paradoxically creates a kind of emotional amplification, where the person absent becomes almost more present in our minds than they were when physically available to us. This phenomenon, known as absence longing, reveals something fundamental about how human attachment and desire function at their core. The mechanism behind this operates through what psychologists call the contrast effect and the scarcity principle. When something is no longer readily accessible to us, our brain assigns it greater value and importance than it held when it was abundantly available. The absent person becomes a kind of blank canvas upon which we project our idealized version of them, stripped of the mundane realities and minor irritations that characterize the actual relationship. We remember their best qualities with crystalline clarity while the small annoyances fade into irrelevance. Additionally, absence creates what we might call psychological incompleteness. Our minds naturally prefer closure and resolution, and an unresolved or distant relationship becomes a persistent, unsolved puzzle that demands our continued attention and emotional energy. What persists despite having no particular logical foundation is how we allow this longing to grow unchecked, often mistaking the intensity of our feelings for evidence of how much we truly loved or valued that person. We rarely question whether the person we're longing for, if suddenly returned to us, would match the perfected mental image we've constructed during their absence. When we wait for something we desire, our brain enters a state of heightened neural activity where the expectation of a future reward becomes almost as psychologically powerful as the reward itself, and sometimes even more so. Consider the experience of waiting for a package to arrive at your door, or the days leading up to a vacation you have planned for months, or even the buildup of tension in a conversation when someone says they have important news to share but asks you to wait until later to hear it. During these periods of anticipation, your mind constructs detailed mental simulations of what might happen, what you will feel, and how the outcome will improve your current state. And this imaginative process triggers the release of dopamine in your brain before any actual positive event has occurred. The psychological mechanism at work here is fundamentally about the gap between your current reality and your imagined future, and the brain interprets this gap as a motivational signal that keeps you engaged, focused, and emotionally invested in the outcome. Marketers and creators have long understood this principle intuitively, which is why they build suspense into their campaigns, why movie trailers show only fragments of a film, why social media influencers announce that big news is coming without revealing it immediately, and why serialized content keeps audiences returning week after week. The anticipation itself becomes the product being sold, not merely the eventual delivery of what was promised. This phenomenon persists despite our intellectual understanding that the anticipation is somewhat illusory, because we have normalized the experience as inherent to desire itself, treating the waiting period as a natural and even desirable part of any worthwhile goal or experience, when in reality we could simply receive what we want immediately and feel satisfied in that moment instead. Consider the moment when you receive a notification on your phone, a small badge with a number alerting you that someone has liked your post, commented on your photo, or sent you a message. You feel a subtle rush, a lifting sensation in your chest, a sense of validation that compels you to immediately check the notification and see who has engaged with you. This immediate pull toward the device, this urgent need to know what has happened in your absence, represents one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior in the modern age, a force rooted in the neurochemical dopamine and its role in our reward system. Dopamine is not actually the chemical of pleasure itself, as many believe, but rather the chemical of anticipation and desire, the neurotransmitter that creates the wanting feeling that drives you to seek out rewarding experiences. When you first learned that checking your phone sometimes yields positive feedback from others, your brain began to associate the act of checking with the possibility of reward, and this association became reinforced with each successful notification you received. Over time, your brain learned to release dopamine in anticipation of checking your phone, even before you actually receive any reward, which is why you find yourself reaching for your device compulsively, even when you consciously know nothing important is waiting for you. This same mechanism operates across all areas of human motivation, from the gambler who keeps pulling the slot machine lever in hopes of hitting the jackpot, to the worker who remains engaged with their task in pursuit of recognition or advancement, to the person scrolling endlessly through social media feeds in search of content that might amuse or surprise them. The dopamine reward system evolved in humans as a survival mechanism, encouraging us to seek food, companionship, and resources necessary for our continued existence. Yet it operates with the same intensity whether the reward is genuinely valuable or merely a fabricated simulation of value designed by others. When two people experience physical touch, make prolonged eye contact, or share moments of vulnerability and emotional intimacy, their bodies release a neurochemical compound called oxytocin, often referred to as the bonding hormone or the love hormone, which creates a powerful sense of connection and trust between them that can feel almost involuntary and deeply compelling. This occurs during a mother nursing her infant, during sexual encounters between partners, during warm embraces with close friends, or even during seemingly simple gestures like holding hands or receiving a gentle massage from someone we care about. The oxytocin floods the brain's neural pathways and simultaneously activates reward centers, creating a feedback loop where the person experiencing this chemical release becomes increasingly drawn to the person or activity that triggered it, reinforcing the desire to repeat that interaction and strengthening the psychological bond in ways that feel natural and inevitable. The remarkable aspect of oxytocin bonding is that it operates beneath the threshold of conscious awareness and rational deliberation, meaning that individuals find themselves deeply attached to and trusting of another person not because they have systematically evaluated whether that person deserves their trust, but because their neurochemistry has been shaped by repeated exposure to oxytocin-triggering interactions that have slowly and steadily rewired their emotional preferences and social priorities. We have normalized this process so completely that we rarely question why we feel inexplicably safe with certain individuals, or why we would rearrange our entire lives for people with whom we have merely shared physical proximity and emotional moments, accepting instead that this is simply how love and friendship work, never fully recognizing that we are largely operating under the influence of a chemical process that evolution designed to ensure survival and reproduction. Not to provide us with accurate information about the actual trustworthiness or long-term compatibility of the people we bond with in this manner. Consider the remarkable phenomenon that occurs when two individuals or groups face a common threat or challenge together, and notice how their bond deepens in ways that months or years of peaceful interaction could never accomplish. When a team of coworkers rallies around a failing project deadline, when neighbors unite to prepare for an approaching storm, when soldiers serve alongside one another in difficult conditions, or when friends support each other through personal loss and hardship, something profound shifts in the quality of their connection. The adversity becomes a crucible that transforms strangers into allies and casual acquaintances into devoted companions, creating bonds so strong that they often persist long after the original challenge has passed. This principle of shared adversity operates through several interconnected psychological mechanisms that make it remarkably efficient at building human connection. When people face difficulty together, they must communicate openly, coordinate their efforts, and depend on one another for support and survival, which naturally builds trust and mutual understanding far more quickly than ordinary social interaction ever could. The shared goal of overcoming the adversity temporarily dissolves petty differences and social hierarchies, allowing people to see each other more authentically and to value each other based on competence, character, and contribution rather than surface-level characteristics. Additionally, the stress of adversity itself triggers the release of bonding hormones and creates intense emotional experiences that become deeply encoded in memory, making the relationship feel uniquely significant and irreplaceable. Yet despite the logical understanding that adversity creates powerful connection, we continue to resist difficulty and seek comfort whenever possible, rarely acknowledging that our most meaningful relationships often emerge precisely from our willingness to face challenges alongside others. Consider a moment when you have shared something deeply personal with another person, perhaps a fear, a disappointment, or a moment of vulnerability, and rather than receiving judgment or dismissal, you encountered someone who simply acknowledged what you were feeling and reflected it back to you with genuine understanding. In that moment, something shifted within your psychological experience, a subtle but profound sense of being seen and understood, and this phenomenon is what we call emotional validation. It represents the human need to have our internal emotional states recognized as real, legitimate, and worthy of acknowledgement by others, and it operates as one of the most powerful forces in shaping how we relate to ourselves and to the world around us. When someone validates our emotions, they are essentially confirming that our feelings are understandable responses to our circumstances, that we are not broken or overreacting, and that our emotional experience has value and meaning, even if the situation itself remains unchanged and unresolved. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is deeply rooted in our neurological and social development, beginning in infancy when caregivers respond to our cries and discomfort with attentiveness and soothing, teaching us that our emotional signals matter and that we can trust others to witness our inner world. This early learning becomes encoded in our brain as a fundamental expectation of human connection, creating neural pathways that associate emotional sharing with safety, acceptance, and belonging. Throughout our lives, we continue to seek this validation because it serves multiple psychological functions simultaneously. It reduces the sense of isolation that often accompanies difficult emotions. It helps us make sense of our experiences through the lens of another's perspective. It builds trust and deepens relationships, and it provides the groundwork for self-compassion and emotional regulation. Consider a moment when someone speaks to you with genuine care, sharing something that weighs heavily on their mind, and you notice how their shoulders seem to relax slightly when you maintain steady eye contact, nod thoughtfully, and ask clarifying questions that demonstrate you have actually absorbed what they said rather than simply waiting for your turn to speak. This is active listening, and what occurs in that exchange is far more profound than a simple transfer of information from one person to another. When you listen without planning your response, without checking your phone, without allowing your mind to wander toward your own concerns or counterarguments, something shifts in the neurochemistry of the person speaking and in your own brain as well. Their sense of being truly heard activates reward centers in their brain, releasing dopamine and oxytocin, chemicals associated with trust, bonding, and feelings of being valued. The speaker begins to perceive you not as a competitor or judge, but as an ally, someone who genuinely cares about their perspective, and this perception fundamentally alters the dynamic of your relationship. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon stems from our deep evolutionary need to be understood and witnessed by others in our social group, a need so primal that its satisfaction creates measurable changes in our physiology and emotional state. Yet despite understanding these benefits intellectually, we live in an era of profound listening failure, where most conversations are actually parallel monologues, where people half listen while formulating rebuttals, where smartphones fragment our attention into ever smaller increments, and where the simple act of being fully present has become so rare that when it occurs, it often shocks people with its apparent unusualness. We have somehow normalized this constant state of distraction and partial engagement, treating genuine active listening as an exceptional gift rather than a foundational element of human connection that our ancestors considered ordinary and necessary for survival and belonging within their communities. When you ask someone a genuinely deep question, one that ventures beyond surface pleasantries and into the territory of authentic human experience, something remarkable often happens in that moment. The conversation shifts. The other person may pause, their eyes might soften, and suddenly there is an opening where vulnerability becomes possible. Questions like, "What are you really afraid of?" Or "When was the last time you felt truly alive?" Or "What would you do if you knew no one would judge you?" Create a psychological environment where the usual social armor becomes unnecessary and people feel invited to reveal something real about themselves. This phenomenon operates through what psychologists call the Reciprocal Vulnerability Principle, wherein when one person demonstrates willingness to engage with authentic inquiry, the other person feels safer doing the same, and this mutual lowering of psychological defenses creates a space where genuine connection can flourish. The mechanism works because deep questions implicitly communicate that you are interested in the actual person before you rather than their socially curated version, and humans have a profound, almost unconscious hunger to be seen and understood in this way. We live in societies saturated with small talk and superficial interaction, where conversations remain perpetually at the level of weather and schedules, and this chronic shallowness creates an unspoken sadness that many people carry without fully acknowledging it. Yet despite the obvious human hunger for meaningful dialogue and connection, most of us rarely ask or answer deep questions in our daily lives, defaulting instead to the safe repetition of familiar conversational patterns that protect us but also isolate us. And somehow we have normalized this emotional distance as though it were simply the cost of civilized society rather than recognizing it as a choice we make repeatedly. Consider the moment when a skilled storyteller captures the attention of an entire room, drawing listeners into a narrative so compelling that time seems to dissolve and resistance melts away. A phenomenon that occurs across cultures, generations, and contexts with remarkable consistency. When a person tells a well-constructed story with genuine emotion and vivid detail, something shifts in the minds of those listening, and their skepticism temporarily recedes, their critical faculties soften, and they become fundamentally more open to influence, persuasion, and belief in whatever message the storyteller wishes to convey. The mechanism underlying this magnetism operates through several interconnected psychological pathways that make narrative one of the most powerful vectors of human influence ever discovered. Stories bypass the analytical part of our brain that typically evaluates claims and evidence, instead activating our imagination and emotional centers, which respond to concrete images, relatable characters, and dramatic tension as though the events were actually happening to us, triggering the release of neurochemicals that bond us psychologically to the narrative and the person delivering it. Furthermore, stories provide context and meaning in a way that abstract arguments or data never can, allowing listeners to experience cause and effect relationships, to inhabit different perspectives, and to understand complex ideas through the lens of human experience rather than pure logic, which makes those ideas far more memorable and persuasive. What is particularly noteworthy is how this magnetism persists even when we consciously recognize its mechanism, remaining effective whether we are aware of the psychological forces at work or not, suggesting that storytelling taps into something so fundamental to human cognition and social bonding that awareness of the technique provides little immunity to its influence. Consider the moment when you walk into a room where someone is genuinely excited about a project, an idea, or an upcoming event. Their energy is unmistakable, their voice carries a particular cadence, their movements seem more animated, their facial expressions are bright and engaged. Within moments, without any logical argument being made, without any conscious decision on your part, you find yourself beginning to feel that same spark of excitement. Your own mood lifts, your attention sharpens, and suddenly, the thing they are enthusiastic about seems more interesting to you as well, even if you knew nothing about it moments before. This phenomenon is called enthusiasm contagion, and it represents one of the most direct forms of emotional transmission between human beings. The mechanism behind this transfer operates primarily through mirror neurons, the neural circuits in our brains that automatically fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that action. When we witness genuine enthusiasm in another person, our brains begin to mimic the neural patterns associated with that emotional state, creating a kind of empathetic resonance that bypasses our rational filters entirely. The enthusiasm is transmitted not through words or logic, but through tone, body language, eye contact, and the subtle physiological markers that accompany genuine passion. What makes this phenomenon particularly interesting is that it operates almost entirely outside conscious awareness, yet it shapes our decisions, our motivation levels, and our willingness to engage with ideas and endeavors. A teacher who genuinely loves their subject will inspire more students than one who merely knows the material well. A salesperson who is authentically excited about what they are selling will convert more customers than one armed with the most compelling facts and figures. A leader who demonstrates real enthusiasm for a vision will mobilize more effort from their team than one who presents a perfectly rational strategic plan. Consider the moment when you and another person laugh together at precisely the same joke, at the same instant, creating a synchronized burst of genuine amusement that seems to ripple between you both like an invisible current. This shared laughter creates an immediate sense of connection and intimacy that transcends the actual humor of the moment itself, binding two people together through a simple acoustic and emotional phenomenon. When we laugh together with someone, our brains release endorphins and oxytocin simultaneously, creating a neurochemical cocktail that literally makes us feel bonded and safe in the presence of that person, even if we have just met them moments before. The shared laughter becomes evidence to both participants that they inhabit the same psychological world, that they understand each other's perspective, and that they find meaning in similar things, which are the foundational elements of human trust and attraction. There is something profoundly reassuring about discovering that another person finds amusement in what amuses you, because it confirms that your perspective on the world is not isolated or strange, but instead shared and validated by at least one other conscious being. Over time, couples and close friends develop their own inside jokes and private humor that excludes others, which strengthens their bond further by creating a sense of membership in an exclusive club where certain references, reactions, and punchlines are understood without explanation. Yet despite the apparent logical simplicity of this mechanism, we remain somewhat baffled by why laughter synchronizes us so deeply, why we can overlook genuine incompatibilities with someone simply because they make us laugh, and why a person who shares our sense of humor seems inherently more trustworthy and attractive than one who does not, even when rational evaluation might suggest otherwise. Consider the moment when someone you care about gently mocks something about your appearance, your mannerisms, or a recent mistake you made, and instead of feeling hurt, you find yourself laughing along with them. Perhaps they comment on how you always take the same route to work, or they mimic your particular way of speaking, or they remind you of that embarrassing story from years past. What unfolds in this interaction is a subtle yet powerful form of social bonding rooted in what psychologists call affiliative humor, where the teasing is delivered with warmth and the unmistakable signal that no genuine harm is intended. The mechanism underlying playful teasing operates through several intersecting psychological pathways. First, it establishes what researchers term safe vulnerability, a state where you permit another person to highlight your imperfections while trusting they do so with affection rather than malice. This requires a baseline level of security in the relationship, which the teasing itself paradoxically reinforces through repetition and acceptance. Second, playful teasing creates a shared inside joke that becomes uniquely yours with that person, establishing an in-group status that excludes others who might not understand the context or appreciate the humor. Third, when you laugh at yourself alongside someone else, you demonstrate psychological flexibility and a lack of fragility, which elevates your status rather than diminishing it in the eyes of the teaser. The person teasing is essentially saying, through their gentle mockery, that they know you well enough to identify your quirks, that they feel comfortable enough to highlight them, and that they trust you to take it in the spirit intended. What makes playful teasing particularly enduring as a social phenomenon is that it requires nothing external, no gifts or grand gestures, yet it creates profound feelings of closeness and mutual understanding. Consider the phenomenon of inside jokes, those peculiar moments of shared laughter that exist exclusively within the boundaries of a small group, often incomprehensible to anyone outside that intimate circle. When two friends burst into uncontrollable laughter at the mere mention of a single word, or when a family references an obscure incident from years past that causes everyone present to immediately understand the humor, we are witnessing one of the most powerful social bonding mechanisms in human interaction. The inside joke requires no explanation, no setup, and often no logical structure that would make it funny to the uninitiated observer. Yet it generates genuine, authentic connection and reinforces the sense that those who share in this knowledge belong to an exclusive club, separated from the rest of the world by the invisible boundary of shared experience and memory. Psychologically, inside jokes function as a form of social currency and group identity marker. When you understand an inside joke, you are signaling membership within a specific social unit, and those who created the joke with you are reinforcing that membership every time the joke resurfaces. The mechanism works through something called cognitive closure and shared memory consolidation. Our brains are wired to feel a sense of belonging when we share coded information with others, especially information that would be meaningless to outsiders. The inside joke essentially becomes a linguistic password that grants access to belonging. What makes inside jokes particularly fascinating is that they often lack any inherent humor value whatsoever. A random phrase, a mispronunciation, a moment of awkwardness captured in time and repeatedly invoked, these things should not be objectively funny, yet they become hilarious precisely because they are owned collectively by the group. We have normalized and accepted this phenomenon entirely, rarely questioning why we find something extraordinarily amusing simply because it belongs to us rather than to the world at large. The inside joke persists because it serves a deeper psychological need for connection and distinction simultaneously. Consider a moment when you find yourself naturally drawn to supporting someone simply because they share your background, your profession, your hometown, or your team affiliation. You might offer them the benefit of the doubt in ways you would never extend to outsiders, overlooking their flaws while magnifying the same behaviors in others. Perhaps you assume positive intentions from members of your group while attributing negative motivations to those you perceive as different. This tendency, operating quietly beneath conscious awareness, shapes countless decisions in workplaces, communities, and social hierarchies. You might recommend a colleague for promotion more readily if they attended your university, vote for a political candidate who shares your cultural heritage, or trust a business owner because they belong to your religious community. The mechanism underlying this pattern roots itself in our evolutionary history as tribal creatures, where survival depended on cooperation within small groups and suspicion of outsiders. Our brains developed to categorize people rapidly into categories of us and them, rewarding loyalty to the in-group with feelings of belonging and security while activating defensive responses toward the out-group. This ancient wiring persists in modern contexts where genuine physical survival is no longer at stake, yet the psychological reward system fires with the same intensity when we favor our perceived tribe. We have collectively normalized this bias so thoroughly that it often goes unrecognized, embedding itself in hiring practices, lending decisions, and social policies. We construct elaborate justifications for why our group members deserve preferential treatment, genuinely believing these rationalizations rather than acknowledging the simpler truth that proximity and similarity trigger automatic favoritism. The persistence of in-group bias, despite its logical indefensibility, reveals how powerfully our psychological inheritance continues to shape our choices. Imagine walking through a shopping district on an ordinary afternoon when you notice a crowd of people gathered outside a restaurant you've never heard of before, all waiting in line with genuine anticipation on their faces, and without consciously deciding to do so, you find yourself drawn toward that same restaurant, assuming that the collective presence of so many people must indicate something worthwhile, something you would be foolish to overlook or dismiss. This is the bandwagon effect in its most visible form, a psychological phenomenon wherein individuals adopt beliefs, behaviors, or preferences primarily because many other people have already done so, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of acceptance that grows stronger with each additional person who joins the crowd. The mechanism at work here is rooted in both cognitive efficiency and social survival instincts, as our brains have evolved to recognize that when large numbers of people move in the same direction or express the same opinion, following that pattern often serves as a reliable shortcut to making good decisions without requiring extensive personal research or analysis. When you observe hundreds of people downloading a particular smartphone application, or wearing a specific brand of clothing, or supporting a particular political candidate, your mind subconsciously calculates that the probability of all these people being wrong simultaneously is relatively low, and therefore you adjust your own preferences and behaviors to align with what appears to be an emerging consensus. What makes this effect particularly persistent in human societies is that it operates largely beneath our conscious awareness, disguising itself as independent thought and personal preference, when in reality we are responding to invisible social currents and informational cascades that sweep through populations like waves through water. Imagine walking into a coffee shop and receiving a free mug with the cafe's logo printed on it, a simple ceramic vessel that costs perhaps $3 to manufacture. You hold it in your hands for a few moments, feeling its weight and warmth, perhaps imagining how it will look on your kitchen shelf. When asked how much you would sell that mug for, you declare a price of $7 or $8, a significant markup from its actual cost. Yet if you had been offered that same mug for purchase without first receiving it as a gift, you would have walked past it without hesitation, unwilling to pay more than $4 or $5 for such an ordinary item. This peculiar phenomenon, wherein we assign greater value to objects simply because we own them, is known as the Endowment Effect, and it represents one of the most persistent distortions in human economic decision-making. The psychological mechanism underlying this effect emerges from our fundamental need to maintain consistency in our self-perception and to justify our choices after we have made them. When we come into possession of something, even temporarily, our brain begins a process of psychological integration, weaving that object into our sense of identity and personal history. We imagine scenarios where we use it, we consider how it reflects our tastes and preferences, and we unconsciously seek to defend our choice to keep it. The mere act of ownership creates what psychologists call an endowment, a sense that the object is now part of our extended self, and to part with it would be to diminish ourselves in some tangible way. What makes this effect particularly resistant to rational correction is that it persists even when we understand intellectually that it makes no logical sense. We know that the mug's objective value has not changed, that its utility is identical whether we own it or do not own it, and yet we continue to demand more money to surrender it than we would pay to acquire it. Consider the person who deeply values environmental conservation, who speaks passionately about protecting the planet and reducing waste, yet continues to drive a gas-guzzling vehicle, purchase excessive single-use plastics, and fly frequently for leisure without hesitation or meaningful attempts to change these behaviors. This individual experiences what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, a state of profound psychological discomfort that arises when a person simultaneously holds two or more contradictory beliefs, or when their actions directly contradict their stated values and self-image. The human mind recognizes this inconsistency at some level, creating an internal tension that demands resolution. Yet rather than confronting the contradiction head-on and making difficult behavioral changes, the person instead engages in elaborate mental gymnastics to rationalize the gap between their beliefs and their actions. They might convince themselves that their individual choices make negligible difference, that the real responsibility lies with corporations and governments, or that their conservation efforts in other areas somehow offset their harmful behaviors. This mental reorganization serves a crucial psychological function. It allows the person to reduce the discomfort of cognitive dissonance without having to actually change their behavior, without having to sacrifice convenience or comfort, and without having to fundamentally alter their lifestyle in ways they find difficult or undesirable. The mechanism operates so smoothly, so invisibly, that people often remain entirely unaware they are engaging in this process at all, believing instead that their justifications represent genuine logical reasoning rather than defensive rationalization. There exists a profound and remarkably consistent pattern in human relationships wherein the simple act of being liked by another person creates an almost irresistible pull toward liking that person in return, a phenomenon so pervasive that it shapes countless interactions across every domain of social life, from intimate romantic partnerships to casual workplace encounters. When someone expresses genuine interest in us, compliments our character or appearance, or demonstrates through their words and actions that they value our presence, something shifts within our psychological framework, and we find ourselves naturally inclined to view that person more favorably than we might have otherwise, regardless of whether we had any initial reason to prefer them. This reciprocal liking operates with such consistency that it has become one of the most reliable principles in social psychology, documented across cultures and age groups, affecting how we perceive others' attractiveness, intelligence, and trustworthiness. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears rooted in several intertwined psychological processes, beginning with a fundamental human need for balance and symmetry in our relationships. For our minds experience discomfort when we perceive an asymmetry in mutual regard, and we naturally work to restore equilibrium by adjusting our feelings to match what we believe others feel toward us. Additionally, when someone likes us, we interpret their positive regard as a form of validation that elevates our self-esteem and confirms our worth in their eyes, making us feel seen and valued, and in gratitude for this affirmation, we reciprocate with warmth and affection. Perhaps most interestingly, we engage in a subtle process of attribution whereby we assume that if someone likes us, they must possess good judgment and discernment, and therefore they are likely a worthwhile person whose opinions and feelings deserve consideration. Imagine walking into a luxury boutique where a simple leather handbag sits on a marble shelf, priced at $2,000, and then entering a discount warehouse where a nearly identical bag is displayed on a metal rack for $40. Most people, when asked which bag is of higher quality, will instinctively believe the expensive one must be superior, even if the materials and craftsmanship are virtually indistinguishable. This phenomenon is called perceived value, and it represents one of the most powerful forces shaping human decision-making and desire. Perceived value is the subjective worth that individuals assign to a product, service, or experience based not necessarily on its actual functional properties, but rather on the context, presentation, brand reputation, scarcity, and psychological cues surrounding it. When a product is displayed in an elegant environment, endorsed by celebrities, wrapped in premium packaging, or given a higher price tag, our brains automatically register it as more valuable, more desirable, and somehow superior to functionally equivalent alternatives. This occurs because our minds use shortcuts called heuristics to evaluate quality quickly, and we have been conditioned throughout our lives to associate price with excellence, exclusivity with worth, and premium presentation with genuine superiority. The mechanism operating beneath this is fundamentally rooted in our evolutionary past, where we learned that higher costs and difficulty of acquisition often correlated with genuine advantages. Yet in modern consumer societies, these signals have become deliberately manipulated. Marketers, designers, and sellers have mastered the art of inflating perceived value through strategic positioning, limited availability claims, aspirational imagery, and the careful cultivation of brand prestige. Knowing that consumers will often pay 5 times more for the perception of quality than for the actual quality itself. Consider the moment when someone walks away from you during a conversation, or when a person you are interested in suddenly becomes less available than they were before, or when an opportunity that seemed within reach suddenly moves further away. In that instant, something shifts within your psychology. Your attention sharpens, your desire intensifies. You find yourself drawn forward, motivated to pursue what was once passive or assured, now transformed into something you must have. This is the chase instinct, and it operates with remarkable consistency across human relationships, commerce, and social hierarchies. A person who shows mild interest suddenly becomes irresistible when they appear indifferent. A product becomes more desirable when it is scarce or when others are competing for it. A goal feels more valuable when obstacles stand between you and its attainment. The chase instinct transforms the passive into the active, the certain into the uncertain, and in doing so, it reorganizes our entire system of desire and motivation. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is rooted in our evolutionary past and reinforced through our neurological reward systems. When something moves away from us, our brain interprets this as potential loss, triggering a cascade of neurochemical responses designed to mobilize action. The hormone dopamine, which is central to motivation and reward anticipation, is released not primarily when we possess something, but when we are pursuing it, when the outcome remains uncertain, when effort is required to attain it. Our ancestors who remained passive when resources moved away from them did not survive to pass on their genes. Those who were driven by a powerful instinct to chase, to pursue, to overcome obstacles and close the distance between themselves and what they desired were the ones who reproduced and shaped the psychology we inherit today. Furthermore, uncertainty itself amplifies this response. The brain finds certainty boring and stimulating only in its anticipation. We are neurologically rewired to pursue what eludes us far more intensely than what we already possess. Consider the person who checks their phone repeatedly throughout the day, never quite knowing when a message or notification might arrive, yet compelled to look again and again despite the knowledge that nothing new has appeared in the last 30 seconds. Consider the gambler who places a bet on a slot machine, aware that the odds are mathematically against them, yet finding the experience more thrilling than the certainty of a guaranteed small reward. Consider the social media user who refreshes their feed endlessly, hoping to see engagement on their posted content, knowing that validation might come in the form of likes and comments, but uncertain exactly when or how many will arrive. This is the principle of reward uncertainty, and it operates as one of the most powerful motivators in human psychology, driving behavior far more effectively than the promise of guaranteed outcomes ever could. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon emerges from how our brains are wired to seek novelty and process unpredictability. When we receive a reward that was uncertain, our brain releases dopamine not only in response to obtaining the reward itself, but more powerfully in response to the uncertainty that preceded it. This variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, as psychologists call it, creates patterns of behavior that are remarkably resistant to extinction, meaning that even when rewards stop coming entirely, the behavior often persists far longer than it would if the reward had always been guaranteed. A predictable reward loses its psychological grip over time as we adapt to it, but an uncertain reward keeps our attention and motivation elevated because our brain is always wondering whether this might be the moment when something valuable arrives. This principle has become so deeply woven into the fabric of modern life that we scarcely question why we engage in behaviors that, by any rational standard, seem inefficient or wasteful, yet we continue them anyway because the possibility of the reward, held in perpetual suspension, feels more compelling than any certainty ever could. Consider the experience of someone who purchases a ticket to a concert for $50, only to discover upon arrival that the performance is underwhelming and the venue is uncomfortable, yet they remain seated through the entire show because they have already paid for admission. This person is experiencing the psychological principle known as investment escalation. a cognitive bias wherein individuals continue to invest time, money, energy, or emotional resources into a pursuit precisely because they have already invested substantially in that same pursuit, regardless of whether the investment shows any signs of generating returns or producing the desired outcome. The mechanism at work here is fundamentally rooted in how human beings process sunk costs and the deeply ingrained psychological need to justify past decisions as having been worthwhile. When we commit resources to something, our minds create a narrative that binds our sense of self and our judgment to that commitment, making it psychologically painful to admit that the investment was questionable or poorly made. We become emotionally attached to the trajectory we have set ourselves upon, and abandoning that path feels equivalent to admitting personal failure or poor judgment, which our psychological defenses naturally resist. This principle extends far beyond entertainment choices and permeates professional decisions, relationship commitments, business ventures, and educational pursuits, where individuals continue pouring resources into situations long after rational analysis would suggest withdrawal or redirection. The fascinating and troubling aspect of investment escalation is that it operates entirely independent of future prospects or present conditions, functioning instead as a mechanism that keeps us locked into past decisions through the simple fact of having made them. Consider the person who has invested 5 years into a relationship that no longer serves them, yet they remain because of the time already spent, or the individual who continues paying for a gym membership they haven't used in months, reasoning that they've already paid for the year and shouldn't waste that money, or the student who pursues a degree they no longer want because they've already completed 3 years of study and are too far along to change direction now. In each of these scenarios, a past investment, whether measured in time, money, emotional energy, or effort, becomes the primary justification for continuing down a path that no longer aligns with present circumstances or future well-being. This is the phenomenon of sunk cost attachment, a cognitive bias where the irretrievable resources already consumed become disproportionately influential in determining future decisions, even when those resources have absolutely no bearing on the value or wisdom of the choice ahead. The psychological mechanism underlying this tendency is rooted in our deep human need to feel that our efforts and sacrifices were not wasted, that our previous choices were justified and rational. When we've invested substantially in something, that investment becomes intertwined with our sense of self and our identity, and to abandon it feels like admitting failure or foolishness, so we convince ourselves that continuing is the only logical course. Yet logically this makes no sense whatsoever, because money already spent is gone forever, time already invested cannot be recovered, and those past costs are entirely separate from the future value we will receive by continuing forward. The remarkable thing is that we know this intellectually, and yet the attachment persists anyway, deeply embedded in how we evaluate decisions and assign meaning to our commitments, suggesting that our need for psychological coherence often overwhelms our capacity for rational economic thinking. Imagine yourself sitting across from a skilled salesperson who begins describing not what their product is, but what your life will look like after you own it. They paint a vivid picture of tomorrow, inviting you to mentally step into a future where the problem you currently face has already been solved by their solution. You find yourself nodding along, already imagining the relief, the confidence, the transformation that awaits you. This technique, known as future pacing, operates by anchoring your decision-making process not in the present moment of skepticism, but in a projected future where the benefits have already materialized and feel entirely real. The mechanism at work here is remarkably straightforward, yet profoundly effective. Your brain does not distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a genuine memory with perfect clarity, particularly when that imagined experience engages multiple sensory dimensions and emotional resonance. When someone guides you through a detailed narrative of your future self enjoying the results of a purchase or commitment, you are essentially creating a false memory of something that has not yet happened, and this false memory becomes neurologically encoded as a kind of advance evidence that the promised outcome is achievable and inevitable. The persuader recognizes that most resistance to decisions stems from uncertainty about consequences, and by collapsing that uncertainty through vivid future imagery, they eliminate one of the primary barriers to agreement. What makes this phenomenon particularly persistent in human behavior is that we have largely normalized the practice of daydreaming and mental rehearsal as a form of authentic decision-making, even though we rarely acknowledge how easily our imaginations can be directed and shaped by the narratives we encounter from others. We accept that imagining ourselves in a future scenario is a legitimate way to evaluate whether something is right for us, yet we often fail to recognize how deliberately constructed and emotionally manipulated those imagined scenarios can be when presented by someone with a vested interest in our choice. Consider the moment when you catch a particular scent, perhaps the smell of your grandmother's perfume or the aroma of a specific cologne worn by someone from your past, and suddenly you are transported back through time, experiencing not just a memory, but the entire emotional landscape of that period of your life. The feelings and sensations rushing back with surprising intensity as if those years had never passed at all. This is emotional anchoring, a profound psychological phenomenon wherein a neutral stimulus becomes so deeply intertwined with a specific emotional experience that encountering that stimulus in the present moment automatically triggers the associated emotional state, regardless of your current circumstances or rational understanding. The mechanism underlying this process is rooted in how our brains encode memories, not as isolated facts but as rich networks of sensory information, emotional responses, and contextual details, all bound together through repeated pairings during significant experiences. When you hear a song that played during a formative relationship, or see a particular color that dominated the environment during an important life event, your nervous system essentially recognizes the stimulus as a reliable predictor of that emotional state, and your brain reinstates those feelings as a form of adaptive preparation, as if your mind is saying that if this stimulus is present, this emotional response should follow. What makes emotional anchoring particularly persistent despite its seemingly illogical nature is that we rarely question the validity of these triggered responses. We simply accept them as authentic emotional reactions rather than recognizing them as learned associations that can be modified or recontextualized. We build entire narratives around these anchored emotions, attributing them to deep truths about ourselves or our experiences, when in reality they are automatic neurological patterns that have been strengthened through repetition and emotional intensity. Imagine walking into a coffee shop on a quiet morning, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee immediately transports you to a memory of sitting with a close friend years ago, laughing without concern about time or responsibility, feeling completely at ease in their presence. That singular scent has now become permanently linked in your mind with safety, comfort, and human connection, even though the coffee itself has no inherent power to create those feelings. This is the principle of positive associations, one of the most subtle yet profoundly influential mechanisms of human psychology and attraction. Our brains are essentially pattern recognition machines that constantly seek to connect experiences, sensations, objects, and people with emotions and outcomes, and once these neural pathways form, they become remarkably difficult to alter or question. When something is repeatedly paired with a positive experience or outcome, our mind begins to automatically assign positive qualities to that thing, even when presented with contradictory evidence or logical reasoning that should override these connections. A particular song becomes meaningful not because of its musical composition alone, but because it was playing during a transformative moment in your life. A specific location becomes special not necessarily because of its architecture or amenities, but because important people gathered there and shared genuine moments with you. A person's mannerisms or appearance can become deeply attractive not purely because of objective standards of beauty, but because those characteristics remind you of someone who treated you well, or they are paired with behaviors of kindness and attentiveness that your mind now associates with attraction itself. The remarkable aspect of positive associations is that they persist and strengthen regardless of whether the original connection was logical or even fully conscious. We continue to feel drawn to these associated things because the emotional response they trigger is entirely genuine and neurologically real, even if the original reason for forming that association was coincidental or circumstantial. Consider the experience of returning to a place you have known for years, perhaps a childhood home, a favorite coffee shop, or even a specific route you take to work each morning, and notice how your nervous system responds with an almost immediate sense of ease and belonging that requires no conscious effort or deliberate decision-making on your part. This phenomenon, known as familiarity comfort, describes the deeply ingrained human tendency to find psychological solace, reduced anxiety, and a genuine sense of safety in environments, people, routines, and experiences that we have encountered repeatedly throughout our lives, regardless of whether those familiar elements are objectively beneficial or even desirable. The mechanism underlying this response operates through multiple interconnected pathways in the brain, where repeated exposure to a stimulus creates established neural pathways and strengthened memory associations that make processing that stimulus require less cognitive energy and feel less threatening to our survival instincts. When we encounter something familiar, our brain has already categorized it, analyzed it, and determined whether it poses a threat, which means we can process it more efficiently than something entirely novel and unknown, and this efficiency naturally translates into a feeling of comfort because our nervous system is not engaged in high alert. Furthermore, familiarity breeds a sense of predictability, and human beings are creatures that desperately crave the ability to predict and control their environment. So when we can anticipate what will happen next based on our previous experiences, we experience a reduction in the existential anxiety that comes from genuine uncertainty about the future. Consider the experience of listening to someone speak whose voice carries what we instinctively recognize as warmth, a quality that seems to emanate from deeper within their being rather than merely existing as an acoustic phenomenon, and notice how this auditory sensation creates an immediate sense of trust and openness in the listener, even before the actual semantic content of their words has fully registered in conscious awareness. A person with vocal warmth typically speaks at a moderate pace with subtle variations in tone and pitch, allowing pauses that suggest thoughtfulness rather than hesitation, and their voice carries an underlying resonance that suggests genuine engagement with both the listener and the subject matter being discussed. In contrast, consider the effect of a voice that sounds rushed, flat, or mechanically uniform, which can trigger subtle apprehension or disconnection in the listener regardless of how factually accurate or well-intentioned the spoken words might be. The psychological mechanism operating here involves what neuroscientists have termed the Prosody effect, wherein the emotional and tonal qualities of speech activate mirror neurons in the listener's brain that simulate the emotional state of the speaker, creating a form of emotional contagion that bypasses logical analysis and operates primarily at the limbic system level. Vocal warmth signals to our ancient survival instincts that the speaker is neither threatening nor deceptive, that they are relaxed enough to modulate their voice with care and intentionality, and that they possess the psychological resources to attend to our experience as listeners rather than merely broadcasting information. Yet, despite understanding intellectually that voice quality should bear no logical relationship to the truthfulness of a statement or the validity of an argument, we continue to grant significantly greater credibility and influence to speakers whose voices carry this warmth, allowing our judgment to be shaped by prosodic features that have nothing to do with actual content accuracy. When you observe two people meeting for the first time, notice how the one who stands with uncrossed arms, relaxed shoulders, and an expansive posture seems to command immediate trust and receptivity from the other person, while the individual who holds themselves in a contracted manner with crossed arms and turned-away orientation creates an invisible barrier that dampens connection and makes others feel unwelcome or defensive in response. This phenomenon operates through a deeply embedded biological mechanism in which our nervous systems read physical postures as signals of either openness or threat, interpreting an open body as a sign that someone is non-defensive, confident, and willing to engage genuinely with others around them. When your body is open, your palms visible, your chest exposed rather than covered, your limbs uncrossed and available, you are unconsciously communicating that you have nothing to hide, that you feel secure enough to be vulnerable, and that you are genuinely present rather than guarded or evaluating whether to trust the other person. The brain of the observer registers these signals instantly and automatically, bypassing conscious thought entirely, and responds by lowering its own defensive barriers and mirroring that openness back to you in a subtle dance of unconscious reciprocity that has been refined through millions of years of human social evolution. What makes this pattern particularly interesting is how thoroughly we have normalized this nonverbal language without ever explicitly teaching it to ourselves, as if we inherited an entire vocabulary of gesture and positioning that speaks louder and more persuasively than words themselves. yet we rarely examine or acknowledge its constant operation in our daily interactions with colleagues, strangers, and loved ones alike. When two people engage in conversation, particularly one of genuine interest or intimacy, a subtle physical shift occurs that reveals the hidden architecture of human connection and attention. One or both parties will begin to lean their upper body forward, closing the distance between themselves and the other person, angling their torso in a way that positions their center of gravity closer to the object of their focus. This leaning in gesture happens almost entirely outside conscious awareness, yet it communicates volumes about engagement, interest, and receptivity. A person leaning in during a conversation signals that they are not merely hearing the words being spoken, but are actively present and emotionally invested in the exchange. This physical posture creates a magnetic quality that draws the other person deeper into the interaction, making them feel genuinely seen and valued. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Physiologically, leaning in reduces the physical distance between bodies, which triggers the release of bonding neurochemicals and creates a sense of intimacy and trust between participants. Psychologically, when someone leans toward us, our brain interprets this as a sign of acceptance and genuine interest, which in turn increases our own willingness to open up and share more vulnerably. We have evolved to read these micro-adjustments in posture as honest signals of investment because they require effort and intention to maintain. The person leaning in is essentially saying, without words, that they value what is being exchanged enough to physically orient themselves toward it. What makes this phenomenon particularly remarkable is how persistently it operates beneath the surface of our awareness, even in an age when we are more conscious than ever of body language and nonverbal communication. We continue to respond to leaning in with enhanced trust and increased disclosure, even when we intellectually understand that it can be manipulated or faked by those with ulterior motives. When someone tilts their head while listening to you speak, a subtle but profound shift occurs in the dynamics of human interaction, one that we have intuitively recognized across cultures and centuries without necessarily understanding why we respond so strongly to this particular gesture. The head tilt, whether performed consciously or entirely unconsciously, functions as a nonverbal signal that communicates attentiveness, curiosity, and a genuine openness to what another person is saying. And this signal operates so powerfully in the human psyche that it can dramatically increase the perceived trustworthiness and likability of the person performing it. When you observe someone tilting their head toward you as you speak, your brain registers this as a sign of active engagement and vulnerability, because the tilted head position exposes more of the neck and throat, areas that are biologically associated with vulnerability and trust, and this exposure sends a primal message that the listener is lowering their defenses in your presence. The mechanism behind this psychological response likely originates from our evolutionary past, when such gestures would have indicated that another person was not preparing for conflict or deception, but rather was genuinely interested in understanding your perspective and maintaining peaceful social bonds. What makes head tilting particularly fascinating is how it influences not only the listener's perception of their own engagement, but also the speaker's confidence and willingness to share more information, creating a reciprocal loop where the simple physical act of tilting the head actually encourages deeper conversation and stronger interpersonal connection. Over time, we have become so accustomed to interpreting this gesture as a sign of genuine interest that we now perform it almost automatically in social situations where we wish to appear engaged, even when we might not feel entirely present. And this habit has become so normalized that many people are entirely unaware they are doing it, or that others are unconsciously evaluating them based on this simple movement. Consider the profound effect of observing someone move deliberately and slowly through space, and how your own perception of them shifts in response to this deliberate pacing. When a person walks slowly into a room, speaks with measured pauses between their words, or gestures with careful, unhurried motions, there emerges in the minds of observers a distinct impression of confidence, control, and command over their environment. This slowness communicates a kind of temporal authority, as though the person moving deliberately has decided that their time is valuable enough to spend it at their own chosen pace, rather than conforming to the rushed rhythms expected of them. By contrast, the person who hurries through space, who speaks rapidly and without reflection, who gestures in quick, jerky motions, is often perceived as anxious, uncertain, or subordinate to the pressures surrounding them. The psychological mechanism underlying this perception relates to our deep evolutionary associations between predator and prey behavior. Predators, secure in their position within the ecosystem, move with deliberate precision because they have no need to rush. Prey animals, by contrast, move in quick, nervous bursts, constantly assessing threats and prepared to flee at any moment. Our brains, still operating partially on these ancient instincts, unconsciously interpret slow movement as a marker of power and security, while rapid movement triggers subtle alarm responses that associate haste with vulnerability and fear. This principle operates so consistently across human cultures and contexts that we have essentially normalized the connection between movement speed and social status, rarely questioning why we make these instantaneous judgments about a person's competence or authority based entirely on the temporal qualities of their physical motion through space. Consider the moment when you first notice someone who has taken care with their appearance, whose hair is neatly styled, whose clothes are pressed and coordinated, whose nails are clean and well-maintained. Your immediate impression shifts, often without conscious awareness, towards seeing them as more competent, more trustworthy, more intelligent, and more worthy of your attention than someone whose appearance suggests less deliberate effort. This phenomenon, known as grooming cues, describes the powerful influence that physical self-presentation exerts over how we judge and respond to other people. When a person demonstrates that they have invested time and resources into their grooming and presentation, we unconsciously interpret this as evidence of self-respect, discipline, and attention to detail, qualities we then generalize to their character and capabilities more broadly. The psychology underlying this response runs deep into our evolutionary history, where the ability to maintain oneself and one's appearance often correlated with health, status, and access to resources. In modern contexts, we have layered additional cultural meanings onto grooming cues, associating certain styles and levels of polish with professionalism, intelligence, and social awareness. What makes this particularly fascinating is how thoroughly we have internalized these associations, treating them as straightforward observations about character rather than recognizing them as projections we are making onto limited visual information. Despite our intellectual understanding that appearance reveals nothing true about someone's capabilities or morality, we continue to weight these cues heavily in our initial assessments and judgments, allowing grooming presentation to influence everything from hiring decisions to romantic attraction to perceived credibility in conversation. We have created a world where the investment in grooming has become nearly mandatory for anyone seeking to be taken seriously, yet we rarely acknowledge explicitly how much of our social sorting is determined by this single, easily manipulated variable. Consider the moment when you observe someone whose mouth remains relatively still, yet their eyes seem to light up with warmth and genuine pleasure. The skin around their eyes crinkles slightly, the outer corners lift almost imperceptibly, and there is a softness that radiates outward from the orbital region that transforms their entire face into an expression of authentic happiness. This is eye smiling, sometimes called Duchenne smiling when the genuine marker is present, and it represents one of the most powerful forms of nonverbal communication that human beings possess. When we encounter this particular configuration of facial muscles, something shifts within our own nervous system almost instantaneously, creating a cascade of positive responses that feels entirely natural and unforced. The person exhibiting eye smiling appears trustworthy, approachable, and fundamentally human in a way that a forced mouth smile simply cannot convey, and we respond to this signal with corresponding openness and reciprocal warmth. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Evolutionarily, eye smiling likely emerged as a reliable indicator of genuine emotional state, one that was difficult to fake and therefore carried significant social weight in determining whether another person could be trusted and whether their intentions toward us were benevolent. The eyes are notoriously difficult to control consciously because the muscles surrounding them are managed by a combination of voluntary and involuntary neural pathways, making true eye smiling a relatively honest signal of internal emotional experience. When we detect this authenticity, our brain interprets it as confirmation that the person before us is experiencing genuine positive emotion directed toward us or our interaction, and this triggers our own mirror neuron systems to activate similar patterns, creating a biological feedback loop of mutual positivity. Consider the simple act of nodding your head while someone speaks to you, a gesture so subtle and automatic that most people perform it without conscious awareness or intention. When you nod during a conversation, you are transmitting a silent message of validation, agreement, and encouragement that influences not only how the speaker perceives themselves in that moment, but also how they continue to construct and develop their thoughts in real time. The speaker, observing your rhythmic head movements, interprets this physical affirmation as evidence that their words are being received well, that their ideas hold merit, and that they should continue in the direction they are moving conversationally. This nodding serves as a powerful reinforcement mechanism that shapes the entire trajectory of dialogue. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through what researchers understand as social feedback loops and embodied cognition. When someone sees you nodding, their brain receives what it interprets as external validation, which triggers the release of neurochemicals associated with confidence and motivation. The speaker's nervous system relaxes slightly, their vocal patterns become more assured, and they elaborate more freely on their ideas, often becoming more creative and articulate in the process. Your nodding has essentially communicated approval and encouragement without you ever speaking a single word. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is how deeply ingrained it has become in human social interaction, despite the fact that a nod carries no inherent logical connection to the quality or truth of what is being said. A person could nod while hearing complete nonsense, yet that physical gesture alone would boost the speaker's confidence and conviction. We have collectively normalized this nonverbal communication to such a degree that we rarely question why a head movement should carry such psychological weight. The nod has become a currency of social interaction, a small physical investment that yields significant returns in terms of influence, rapport, and behavioral modification. Consider the moment when someone offers you a compliment that feels distinctly different from the hollow praise you encounter throughout your ordinary day. A comment that touches upon something specific and true about who you are or what you have accomplished, delivered with a tone of sincerity that cannot be manufactured or faked. In this instant, something shifts within you, a warmth spreads through your chest, and you find yourself more inclined toward that person, more willing to cooperate with them, more interested in their well-being and thoughts. The genuine compliment operates on a foundation of psychological principle that reaches deep into human nature itself, for it accomplishes something that generic flattery cannot achieve. When someone notices and articulates a genuine positive quality about you, they are essentially validating your existence in a way that feels like recognition rather than manipulation. And this validation triggers a reciprocal response in the human brain that makes you want to view that person more favorably in return. The mechanism works because genuine compliments require authentic observation and true attention. They demonstrate that someone has paid enough care to you to notice something real, something particular about your character or actions that distinguishes you from everyone else around you. This creates a psychological bond rooted in the principle of reciprocity, where your brain interprets the compliment giver's investment of attention and effort as a signal that they genuinely value you, and consequently, you feel compelled to return that valuation. Yet despite the straightforward logic of this mechanism, we have constructed a cultural landscape where people remain hesitant to offer genuine compliments freely, afraid of appearing insincere or overstated, withholding the very tool that could deepen human connections and create more compassionate communities. When we encounter someone who openly admits their struggles, their fears, their failures, or their uncertainties, something shifts in how we perceive them and relate to them, yet this response operates almost invisibly beneath our conscious awareness. A person who shares that they are struggling with anxiety, that they made a serious mistake in their business, or that they feel inadequate in some aspect of their life somehow becomes more trustworthy, more human, and paradoxically more influential than the person who maintains a perfect facade. The mechanism at work here is profound. Vulnerability acts as a psychological mirror that reflects our own humanity back to us, dissolving the artificial barriers we construct between ourselves and others. When someone admits their imperfection, they signal that they are operating from a place of authentic truth rather than strategic performance, and this authenticity triggers a reciprocal response in others, a willingness to lower our own defensive walls and engage with genuine honesty. The person who admits weakness simultaneously demonstrates a kind of strength, the strength that comes from accepting oneself fully and refusing to waste energy on maintaining an exhausting illusion. Yet despite this being among the most universally resonant human experiences, we continue to build social systems, professional hierarchies, and personal relationships that reward the opposite behavior, where admitting uncertainty is seen as liability rather than as the foundation of true connection and influence. We normalize the presentation of a curated self while simultaneously feeling drawn to those rare individuals who refuse this performance, as though vulnerability is both forbidden and irresistible, creating a peculiar contradiction in how we navigate the social world, where our deepest attractions to others are often rooted in the very authenticity we are trained to suppress in ourselves. Consider the person who enters a room with an open demeanor, who makes eye contact, who speaks with genuine warmth, and who demonstrates a willingness to be present with another human being in conversation. People are drawn to this person almost magnetically, often without understanding why, and what draws them is something we might call emotional availability. This is the capacity and willingness of an individual to be psychologically and emotionally present, to receive the feelings and experiences of others without judgment, and to reciprocate with authentic engagement rather than performance or distance. When someone is emotionally available, they signal through their words, tone of voice, facial expressions, and body language that they have space in their internal world for another person, that the other person matters enough to deserve genuine attention, and that vulnerability will not be rejected or weaponized. The mechanism underlying this attraction is fundamentally rooted in our deepest human need for connection and recognition. From infancy, we are wired to seek attunement with caregivers who respond to our emotional states with understanding and care, and this neurological pattern persists throughout our entire lives. When we encounter someone who offers this kind of emotional attunement as adults, we experience something that feels almost like home, a reprieve from the constant vigilance required in a world where most interactions feel transactional or conditional. The person who is emotionally unavailable, by contrast, sends signals of distance, distraction, or conditional regard, and we sense these signals immediately, sometimes at a level beneath conscious awareness. What persists despite its simplicity is how rarely we encounter genuine emotional availability in modern life, and how desperately we hunger for it when we do. We have constructed a culture that rewards emotional withholding as strength, that frames vulnerability as weakness, and that encourages us to armor ourselves against disappointment by maintaining a degree of perpetual distance from others. Consider the moment when someone leans close to you and speaks in a soft, lowered voice, their words meant for your ears alone while others exist nearby. And notice how this simple act of vocal proximity creates an immediate sense of connection and trust that seems disproportionate to the actual information being conveyed. In social settings, professional environments, and intimate relationships alike, we find that people who speak to us in whispered tones, who deliberately reduce their volume and draw us physically nearer, trigger a profound psychological response rooted in our deepest need to feel seen and chosen. The whispered communication carries an implicit message that what is being shared is exclusive, confidential, and valuable enough to warrant this special treatment, and our brains interpret this exclusivity as a marker of genuine relationship rather than merely a practical necessity for privacy. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through what neuroscientists call proximity-based intimacy conditioning, wherein the physical closeness required to hear a whisper activates the same neural pathways associated with trust, bonding, and emotional safety that would normally develop over extended periods of time. When someone whispers to us, they are essentially collapsing the usual distance requirements that our social instincts demand before we lower our psychological guards, and we instinctively reciprocate this gesture by opening ourselves more fully, sharing information more freely, and attributing greater importance to the relationship. What remains remarkable is how this effect persists even when we consciously understand that whispered communication might simply be a practical courtesy, a technique for avoiding disturbing others, or in many cases, a deliberate manipulation strategy employed by those seeking to influence our behavior. We have normalized the assumption that quietness equals closeness, that reduced volume somehow translates into increased sincerity, and that the physical intimacy of proximity necessarily reflects emotional authenticity. Imagine yourself in a heated negotiation where both parties have laid out their positions, the tension sits thick in the air, and everyone is waiting for the next move, yet you choose to say nothing at all. You simply sit quietly, maintaining calm eye contact, breathing steadily, allowing the weight of your presence and composure to fill the space where words might have gone. The other person, growing increasingly uncomfortable in that silence, begins to fill the void themselves, revealing information they had not intended to share, making concessions they had not planned to make, or questioning the strength of their own position. This is the power of strategic silence, one of the most underutilized tools in human influence and communication. The mechanism operates on several interconnected psychological principles that make it remarkably effective in a wide range of interpersonal contexts. Silence creates a vacuum in communication that the human brain finds deeply uncomfortable to tolerate, and this discomfort compels people to fill the emptiness with words, thoughts, and often self-sabotaging revelations. Additionally, silence conveys confidence and control in ways that words cannot match. A person who remains silent after making their point appears certain, unbothered, and powerful, while someone who continues talking appears defensive, uncertain, or even desperate for validation. Furthermore, silence forces genuine listening and processing, as it removes the distraction of constant verbal stimulation and allows the other person's nervous system to become hyper-aware of subtle cues, intentions, and the unspoken dimensions of the conversation. Yet despite understanding these mechanisms intellectually, most people remain terrified of silence and rush to fill every pause with unnecessary chatter, filler words, and defensive explanations that undermine their own positions. When you enter a room and observe someone standing with their shoulders back, their chins slightly elevated, and their movements deliberate and unhurried, you are witnessing confidence signaling, a deeply embedded human behavior that communicates status, competence, and trustworthiness without a single word being spoken. This person has learned, either consciously or through years of social conditioning, that the physical manifestation of certainty itself becomes a form of persuasion, a silent language that others instinctively decode as evidence of genuine capability and authority. In job interviews, first dates, business negotiations, and countless other high-stakes social encounters, individuals who maintain steady eye contact, speak with a measured pace rather than rushed or stuttering cadence, and occupy physical space with ease are consistently perceived as more intelligent, more capable, and more worthy of trust than equally qualified individuals who display nervous fidgeting, averted gazes, or tentative speech patterns. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates on several interlocking levels of human perception. From an evolutionary perspective, confidence signals may have originally served as indicators of physical health and dominance, traits that correlated with survival advantage and reproductive success, and these ancient neural pathways remain active in our modern brains even when physical prowess is entirely irrelevant to the situation at hand. Neurologically, observing someone display confident body language activates mirror neurons in our own brains, causing us to instinctively feel a sense of calm and assurance in their presence, as though their certainty is contagious and transferable. Additionally, confidence signaling creates a self-reinforcing feedback loop, where the person displaying confidence feels more confident due to positive social responses, which then generates even more convincing signals of competence, while those displaying uncertainty trigger skepticism and withdrawal in observers, paradoxically making them less confident still. Consider the moment when someone speaks about something they genuinely care about, their eyes widening, their voice rising with intensity, their entire body language shifting into alignment with their words, and notice how the people listening to them begin to shift as well, their own energy lifting, their skepticism momentarily suspended, their doubt replaced by a curious form of resonance that mirrors what they are witnessing. This phenomenon is passion transfer, the remarkable ability of authentic enthusiasm to leap from one person to another without explicit instruction or rational argument, spreading like a contagion that bypasses the logical mind entirely and settles instead into the emotional and intuitive centers of those who encounter it. When a speaker believes deeply in what they are saying, when their conviction is genuine and their commitment unquestionable, listeners do not simply hear words, but they absorb the conviction itself. They absorb the certainty that underlies the words, and this transfer of emotional energy often proves far more persuasive than any carefully constructed argument or mountain of evidence could ever be. The mechanism operates through a combination of mirror neurons, which cause us to internally simulate the emotional states we observe in others, and through the ancient human capacity for emotional contagion, wherein feelings and states of being seem to transmit between people through proximity and attention rather than through logical channels. We have evolved to trust emotional authenticity more than rational explanation because authentic passion has historically indicated genuine knowledge or important discovery, making it a reliable signal in ancestral environments where information traveled slowly and verification was difficult. Yet in our modern world, this deeply embedded psychological response persists even when we encounter passion directed toward trivial pursuits or even harmful beliefs, demonstrating how completely we remain enslaved to these ancient mechanisms despite our contemporary sophistication and access to unlimited information that should theoretically protect us from such influence. When two people exchange confidential information that they agree to keep from others, something profound shifts in their relationship, and this phenomenon is what we call the psychology of shared secrets. Imagine a colleague pulling you aside at work and confiding in you about a personal struggle, or a friend telling you something they have never told anyone else, binding you together with the weight of their vulnerability and trust. In these moments, you become part of an exclusive circle, a keeper of something precious and private, and this creates an immediate and powerful bond that transcends ordinary social connection. The person who shares a secret with you has essentially chosen you above all others, making you feel special, selected, and valued in a way that casual conversation cannot replicate. This selective disclosure signals that they believe in your trustworthiness, your discretion, and your capacity to hold their truth without judgment or betrayal. From a psychological standpoint, this works through several mechanisms operating simultaneously in the human mind. First, there is the principle of reciprocal vulnerability, where allowing someone to see our authentic self behind our social mask creates an expectation that they will reciprocate with equal openness and honesty. Second, the act of sharing something forbidden or private activates what psychologists call the forbidden fruit effect, where anything prohibited or restricted becomes psychologically more valuable and memorable. Third, the secret creates what researchers term a shared identity, a private world that exists only between two people, separate from the external social order and its rules. We have normalized this bonding mechanism so thoroughly that we rarely question why the exchange of confidential information should matter so deeply, yet it remains one of the most reliable ways to accelerate intimacy and connection between humans. The secret becomes a psychological contract, an unspoken agreement that binds two people together through mutual trust and mutual risk, and this contract holds remarkable power over human behavior and loyalty. Consider the moment when someone makes a joke during a serious conversation, or when a person uses lighthearted banter to ease tension in an awkward social situation, or when a child's infectious giggle causes an entire room of adults to suddenly smile despite their worries. The playful approach to communication and interaction possesses a remarkable power to shift our perception of the person delivering it, making them appear more likable, more trustworthy, and more attractive to those around them. When someone demonstrates the ability to not take themselves too seriously, to find humor in difficult circumstances, or to engage in witty exchanges without malice, we instinctively feel drawn to them because playfulness signals confidence, psychological flexibility, and an absence of defensive rigidity. The mechanism underlying this attraction is rooted in our evolutionary past, where the ability to maintain perspective and find levity during hardship was indicative of emotional resilience and social intelligence. Playfulness also creates what psychologists call a positive emotional state, and humans have a fundamental tendency to associate pleasant emotions with the source of those emotions, meaning we naturally gravitate toward people who make us feel lighter and less burdened by existence. Additionally, playfulness disarms our defensive mechanisms because humor and lightheartedness signal a lack of threat or aggression, which allows us to lower our psychological guard and become more open to influence and connection. What makes this phenomenon particularly resilient in human social dynamics is that we have collectively normalized the value of seriousness and productivity, yet we simultaneously crave relief from the constant weight of these demands, creating a paradox wherein we respect those who play while structuring our lives around those who do not. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of anticipatory excitement, wherein the human mind generates profound emotional states and physiological responses not from present circumstances, but from imagined future events that have not yet occurred and may never occur at all. A person might spend weeks in a state of elevated mood and heightened energy in the days leading up to a vacation, a birthday celebration, or a significant social gathering. and yet the actual experience, when it finally arrives, often fails to match the intensity of the emotional anticipation that preceded it. The mind constructs elaborate narratives about what will happen, how wonderful it will feel, and how transformative the experience will be, and this mental construction generates real neurochemical changes in the brain, releasing dopamine and other neurotransmitters that create genuine feelings of pleasure, expectation, and joy. The anticipatory phase often becomes more rewarding than the actual event itself, a reversal of logic that we rarely acknowledge or question. This mechanism operates because the human brain is fundamentally a prediction machine, constantly forecasting future states and preparing the body for outcomes that exist only in imagination. The anticipatory excitement serves an evolutionary function, as it motivated our ancestors to plan, prepare, and travel toward resources and social connections that enhance survival. Yet in modern life, this same mechanism often becomes decoupled from any practical purpose. We have normalized this strange disassociation between imagined futures and lived presents so thoroughly that we seldom recognize how much of our emotional life is spent in advance of actual experience rather than within it. The person planning the vacation may derive more total happiness from weeks of anticipation than from the actual trip itself. Yet society has accepted this as natural and unremarkable, never questioning why we choose to live so persistently in the future rather than in the present moment where life is actually occurring. Imagine yourself standing in a crowded room and you suddenly realize you have a small stain on your shirt or you've made a minor social mistake, perhaps stumbling over your words during a conversation. In that moment, you feel as though every single person in the room is staring directly at you, judging you, analyzing every detail of your appearance and behavior with intense scrutiny. You become acutely aware of yourself, convinced that you are the center of everyone's attention, that your flaw or misstep has somehow become the focal point of the entire gathering. This is the spotlight illusion, a cognitive bias where we dramatically overestimate the degree to which other people are noticing and evaluating us. The mechanism behind this phenomenon stems from the simple fact that we have privileged access to our own thoughts, feelings, and insecurities. We are hyper-aware of our own internal experiences in ways that others simply cannot be. When something embarrassing happens to us, our attention becomes sharply focused on that moment, and this intense internal focus creates a false sense that the external world must be equally focused on us. Our minds struggle with perspective-taking, and we unconsciously assume that what looms large in our own consciousness must also loom large in the minds of those around us. The spotlight illusion persists despite being logically indefensible, because our subjective experience of self-consciousness feels so real and so powerful that we find it difficult to imagine others are not experiencing the same intensity of attention toward us. We have normalized this phenomenon as a natural part of social anxiety and self-awareness, accepting it as an inevitable human experience rather than recognizing it as a systematic distortion of social reality. Yet if we observe others making similar mistakes, we typically notice them briefly before our attention shifts elsewhere, proving that the spotlight we imagine shining on us rarely, if ever, truly exists in the way we fear. Consider the person who asks for something once and receives rejection, yet returns weeks later with the same request, only to find that circumstances have shifted and the answer becomes yes. This phenomenon, known as gentle persistence, operates through a quiet but powerful mechanism within human psychology and social dynamics. When we encounter repeated contact from someone who maintains a respectful demeanor and does not become aggressive or demanding, our resistance gradually diminishes not because they have worn us down through force, but because their consistency signals genuine commitment and because the psychological weight of their request accumulates in our mind through mere repetition. The brain begins to normalize what was once unfamiliar or unwelcome, and familiarity breeds a peculiar form of acceptance. We see this in sales environments where the most successful practitioners are not the aggressive closers, but rather those who maintain regular, friendly contact with prospects over months, allowing the relationship to deepen and trust to compound. We observe it in personal relationships where someone who asks for a favor repeatedly, without pressure or manipulation, eventually finds their requests granted simply because the other person has grown accustomed to saying yes to them. The psychological mechanism underlying this involves what researchers call the mere exposure effect combined with the commitment and consistency principle. When we are exposed to something repeatedly in a neutral or positive context, our attitudes toward it shift favorably. Additionally, once we have said yes to something small, we become psychologically committed to a pattern of saying yes, making larger requests seem less jarring when they come from the same source. What makes gentle persistence particularly effective is that it operates beneath the threshold of conscious resistance. Unlike aggressive pressure, which triggers defensiveness and resentment, gentle persistence feels almost invisible, like a river gradually wearing down stone. Imagine walking into a room and immediately sensing that someone is fully present with you, their attention undivided, their responses genuine rather than performed, their words carrying the weight of actual thought rather than rehearsed pleasantries, and you find yourself naturally drawn toward them, trusting them more readily, and feeling more comfortable in their company despite knowing nothing concrete about their credentials or accomplishments. This person exhibits what we might call authentic presence, and their influence over others seems to operate almost effortlessly, requiring no manipulation, no carefully constructed persona, and no strategic positioning within social hierarchies. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon rests upon a fundamental human capacity for detection, one that neuroscience has begun to map through mirror neurons and theory of mind systems, which allow us to perceive the congruence or incongruence between what someone is saying and what their body language, tone, and energy are actually communicating to us at a preconscious level. When a person is truly present, when their internal state and external expression align seamlessly, when they are not running calculations about how they appear or what effect they are producing, we pick up on this alignment instantaneously and respond to it with a sense of safety and authenticity that cannot be faked or manufactured through technique alone. What makes this phenomenon particularly remarkable is how thoroughly we have normalized the opposite condition in modern life, where fragmentation of attention has become so commonplace that genuine presence has transformed into something almost transgressive, almost shocking in its rarity, and yet when we encounter it, we recognize it immediately as a form of power that requires no assertion, no dominance, and no performance, only a commitment to showing up without masks or filters.